Hello, Ranger Screams family. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you so much for your amazing support and all of your comments. They truly mean a lot to me. Before we begin, let's try to reach 2,000 likes and 2,000 comments on this video. Every like and comment helps the channel grow and reach more horror fans. If you're not subscribed yet, I'd love for you to join the Ranger Screams family by subscribing. Thank you for being here. And now let's begin tonight's story. I wasn't exactly new to danger. After all, I'd been a Green Beret for nearly a decade, and this wasn't my first time in a place where something felt wrong, even if you couldn't quite put your finger on it. The year was 2005, and we were deep in a remote stretch of Alaska, tasked with investigating some unusual happenings at a military outpost. The government doesn't exactly advertise that these things happen, but when soldiers start disappearing in broad daylight and classified equipment goes missing, they send in someone like me. I'm Quentin Arliss, and the job was supposed to be a routine sweep, nothing more. If it had been just that, you wouldn't be hearing about it now. The briefing had been suspiciously light on details. Colonel Harrington had merely slid a thin folder across his desk, his face a mask of practiced indifference. 4 men stationed at Outpost 37 have gone missing in the last month, he'd said. The last communication mentioned equipment malfunction and strange noises from the lower levels. Standard procedure is to assume desertion or accident, but, I'd pressed. But this is the 3rd incident at that location in 20 years. The place should have been decommissioned after the Cold War. Someone keeps it operational for a reason. The helicopter dropped us off 10 miles from the outpost, the pilot refusing to go any closer due to atmospheric disturbances. We trudged through snow that came up to our knees, the bitter cold seeping through our thermal gear despite its military-grade protection. My team consisted of 4 men besides myself. Bennett, the communications specialist with a perpetual scowl. Morris, our weapons expert who could disassemble and reassemble any firearm blindfolded. Reeves, a medic who'd seen enough combat to make most veterans look like rookies. And Kendrick, our demolitions guy who could rig explosives with surgical precision. Then there was Russell, the intelligence officer who'd been forced upon us at the last minute. He wasn't field material, too twitchy, too academic, but he had clearance levels that surpassed even mine. Whatever was happening at Outpost 37, the brass wanted someone with access to know about it. "You're unusually quiet, Russell," I remarked as we made our way through a particularly dense patch of pines. "Care to share what's really going on here?" He adjusted his glasses, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Just following orders, Staff Sergeant. Same as you." "Bull," Bennett muttered. "Nobody sends a team like us for missing persons. What aren't you telling us?" Russell's face remained impassive. "The outpost housed sensitive equipment. That's all you need to know." The place was an abandoned Cold War installation, a long-forgotten relic buried beneath miles of dense, freezing wilderness. On the surface it was mostly concrete bunkers and rusted-out towers, but underneath there were endless corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, most of them inaccessible after decades of neglect. That's where the real concern was. Something was happening down there, and we were sent to find out what. I remember thinking, as we approached the outpost, how desolate it looked. A few decrepit buildings still stood, though they sagged under the weight of years of snow and neglect. And then there were the footprints, or rather, the lack of them. It was winter, and the snow had recently fallen, but it was like the place had been abandoned for ages. That didn't make sense, given that soldiers had been stationed there just a few weeks before. There should have been tracks, signs of life, but there was nothing. Not a single print. "This doesn't add up," Morris said, voicing what we were all thinking. "If there were men stationed here 2 weeks ago, where are the footprints? The snow's fresh, but not that fresh." Russell pulled out a device that looked like a modified radar gun. "I'm picking up heat signatures from inside the main building. Faint, but present." "Human?" I asked. He frowned. "Inconclusive." We approached the main entrance, a heavy steel door that should have been locked but hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Above it, the faded insignia of some long-defunct military project was barely visible through the frost. "Welcome to Outpost 37, I muttered, shouldering my rifle. "Let's see what's worth dying for out here in the middle of nowhere." The door opened with a groan that echoed through the empty corridors, a sound that seemed to bounce back at us from depths we couldn't see. The darkness inside was almost complete, swallowing the beams of our flashlights after just a few feet. "Power should be on," Russell said, consulting his tablet. "Emergency generators at minimum." Kendrick found the main switch panel, its cover hanging loose. "Wiring's been chewed through. Something's been added." "Animals?" Reeves suggested. I examined the damage. The cuts were too precise, too deliberate. No animal I've ever seen. We rigged up temporary lighting using our field kits, casting long shadows down the hallways. The place was a maze of corridors and rooms, most of them empty save for rusted filing cabinets and desks covered in a thick layer of dust. Yet some areas looked recently disturbed, as if someone or something had been moving through the complex. According to the schematics, Russell said, tracing a path on his tablet, the main research facility is 2 levels down. That's where the missing personnel were last stationed. Research facility? I questioned. I thought this was an observation post. Russell didn't meet my eyes. It was, among other things. The stairwell leading down was pitch black, our flashlight beams seeming to get swallowed by the darkness rather than penetrate it. The air grew noticeably colder as we descended, carrying a strange smell, like ozone and something else I couldn't quite place. I don't like this, Morris whispered, his hand tight around his weapon. Something's off. I nodded. 20 years in the field gives you a sixth sense for danger, and right now every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back. But orders were orders, and whatever was down there, we needed to find it. Stay alert, I said, taking point as we reached the bottom of the stairs, and watch each other's backs. Little did I know that within hours, not all of us would be coming back up those stairs alive. The second level of the outpost was in better condition than the first, cleaner, with fewer signs of decay. The lights actually worked here, flickering on automatically as we moved through the hallways. It was as if this part of the facility had been maintained while the upper level was allowed to rot. Why keep the lower levels operational? Bennett asked, echoing my thoughts. Seems like a waste of resources for an abandoned outpost. Russell moved ahead, his attention fixed on a series of readings from his device. The facility was officially decommissioned in 1991, but certain projects remained active. Limited personnel, minimal oversight. What kind of projects? I pressed. The classified kind, he replied, not looking up. The hallway opened into what appeared to be a control room. Banks of computers and monitoring equipment arranged in concentric circles around a central platform. Most of the screens were dark, but a few still glowed with text and data scrolling too fast to read. Someone's been here recently, Reeves noted, running a finger along one of the consoles. No dust. Morris moved to one of the active monitors, squinting at the display. These are system logs. Last entry was 13 days ago. I leaned over his shoulder to look. The entry was brief. Anomalous readings from Sector 7, requesting backup from main facility. No response. The rest was corrupted, digital garbage that made no sense. What's in Sector 7? I asked Russell. He consulted his tablet, brow furrowing. It's not on the official schematics. Must be part of the classified section. So we have missing personnel, mysterious readings, and a secret area not on the maps, Kendrick summarized. Just another day in paradise. We continued our exploration, moving through laboratories and storage rooms filled with equipment I didn't recognize. The technology looked advanced, far beyond what should have been available during the Cold War era. In one room we found what appeared to be medical facilities, surgical tables with restraints, monitoring equipment, and walls lined with containers of preserved specimens. They looked like tissue samples, but distorted, wrong somehow. These are human, Reeves said quietly, examining one of the containers. But the cellular structure is altered. I've never seen anything like it. Russell was suddenly at his side, taking the container from his hands. These are classified materials. Don't touch anything else. The tension in the room thickened. There was clearly more going on here than a simple search and rescue operation. Time to level with us, Russell, I said, my patience wearing thin. What exactly happened here? What were they working on? He hesitated, then sighed. In the 1980s, this facility was part of a program studying anomalous signals detected in the region. They believed they were intercepting transmissions of non-terrestrial origin. You're saying they were hunting aliens? Bennett scoffed. I'm saying they detected signals they couldn't explain, Russell corrected. The program evolved from passive monitoring to active research. That's all I'm cleared to tell you. And the missing personnel? I pushed. We're here to retrieve data and specimens after unexpected activity was detected last month. They reported finding evidence that the original research team had discovered something. Then they stopped reporting in. A crash from the next room cut our conversation short. We moved instantly into defensive positions, weapons raised. The sound had come from behind a heavy door marked Cold Storage, Authorized Personnel Only. I nodded to Kendrick, who positioned himself to breach the door while the rest of us prepared to enter. On my signal, he hit the release and we swept in. flashlights and gun barrels, sweeping the darkness. The cold storage room was vast, lined with cylindrical tanks that reached from floor to ceiling. Most were empty, their glass fronts cracked or shattered, but a few still contained murky liquid. Something had clearly broken out of, or into, several of the tanks, leaving behind twisted metal and broken glass. "What the hell were they keeping in these?" Morris whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. I approached one of the intact tanks, wiping condensation from its surface to peer inside. What I saw made me step back involuntarily. Floating in the preservation fluid was what appeared to be a human form, but twisted, changed. The limbs were elongated, jointed in places where no joints should be. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over a frame that wasn't quite human. Was that a person?" Reeves asked, his professional detachment slipping. Before Russell could answer, a skittering sound echoed through the room, like nails on metal, but faster, more chaotic. We froze, listening. It seemed to come from above, then behind, then all around us. "Movement at your 3 o'clock, Bennett hissed, his rifle tracking something I couldn't see. A shadow darted between the tanks, too fast to follow. Then another, on the opposite side of the room. We were surrounded. "Fall back to the door," I ordered, keeping my voice steady. Slow and tight. We began to retreat, moving as a unit, backs to each other. The skittering grew louder, more frenzied, as if excited by our movement. That's when we saw the first body. It was wedged between two of the broken tanks, almost hidden in the shadows. What remained of the uniform identified it as one of the missing soldiers, but the body itself was barely recognizable as human. It had been torn apart, not by bullets or explosives, but by something with immense strength and precision. The wounds weren't ragged but clean, surgical almost, as if something had been methodically taking the body apart to see how it worked. Russell was fumbling with his equipment, trying to pick up the source of the last transmission when we heard another sound. It was faint, just a rustle, like something scraping across the floor. We all froze. The others looked at me for direction, but I didn't have to tell them what to do. We were trained to react instantly, and our weapons were ready. The sound grew louder, but it didn't come from any particular direction. It was all around us, echoing through the long, narrow corridors. Russell whispered something about it being impossible, but I was too focused to pay attention. The scraping stopped, and in its place there was a kind of clicking noise, irregular and too mechanical to be an animal, but too organic to be machinery. "We need to move," I said quietly. "Now." As if in response, the lights in the cold storage room went out, plunging us into darkness, save for our flashlights. In the sudden blackness, the clicking sounds multiplied, coming from every direction at once. "Move," I shouted, abandoning stealth for speed. "Back to the control room." We ran, the sounds pursuing us through the darkness. Something brushed against my leg as I ran, something cold and rough that moved too quickly to see. Kendrick screamed from somewhere behind me, the sound cut short by a wet, gurgling noise. "Kendrick," Reeves called, turning back. "Keep moving," I ordered, grabbing his arm. "We can't help him if we're dead." We made it back to the control room, sealing the heavy door behind us. Bennett was bleeding from a cut on his arm, 4 parallel slashes that went straight through his tactical gear. "What the hell was that?" he panted, as Reeves applied pressure to the wound. "Not what?" Russell said, his face pale as he stared at his tablet. "How many?" Before I could ask what he meant, the tablet's screen filled with images from security cameras we hadn't noticed before. They showed the corridors we'd just fled through, now crawling with movement. Dark, skeletal figures moved with unnatural speed, some on all fours, others contorting themselves through spaces too small for their frames. They weren't heading toward us. They were heading deeper into the facility. "They're going to Sector 7, Russell whispered. "They know we're here. They're preparing." "Preparing what?" Morris demanded. Russell looked up, his eyes hollow with fear. "The transmission. They're going to send another transmission. Bennett told me to pull out, but that wasn't an option. Not with Kendrick unaccounted for and whatever those things were moving deeper into the facility. If they were heading to this mysterious Sector 7, that's where we needed to go too." "Russell," I said firmly, "no more half-truths. What exactly are we dealing with here?" He hesitated, then set his tablet down, revealing a classified file that shouldn't have been in our possession. In 1983, researchers at this facility detected a signal coming from what they believed was deep space. They managed to isolate and record it, but when they played it back for analysis, something happened. "What kind of something?" Morris pressed. The researchers exposed to the full signal experienced rapid physiological changes. Their cellular structure began to alter, their DNA rewriting itself. Most died within hours, their bodies rejecting the changes. But a few survived longer, changing into something else. The program was officially terminated, the survivors contained, and the whole incident buried. Those things we saw, they're the survivors? From the 80s? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Russell shook his head. No, those would have died decades ago. These are new. Someone reactivated the research recently, possibly using the original samples. The team sent in last month must have been exposed. Reeves finished bandaging Bennett's arm. So, what's in Sector 7? The original transmission equipment, Russell said quietly. And if my theory is correct, they're trying to boost the signal, send it somewhere. Or to someone. The implications hung in the air between us. Whatever these things were, whatever they had once been, they weren't just mindless mutations. They had purpose, direction. We need to destroy that equipment, I decided, and then get the hell out of here. And Kendrick? Bennett asked. I met his eyes steadily. We look for him on the way, but the mission comes first. Russell pulled up schematics on his tablet, revealing hidden passages not on the official maps. Sector 7 is here, at the lowest level. There's an access point through the maintenance tunnels that might bypass wherever those things are gathering. We gathered what supplies we had, including extra ammunition and the few explosives we'd brought with us. Reeves distributed emergency medical kits, small but comprehensive packages that included powerful painkillers and stimulants. Just in case, he said grimly. We moved carefully through the facility, following Russell's directions to a service elevator hidden behind a false wall in one of the storage rooms. It was barely operational, the mechanisms groaning in protest as we descended to the lowest level. The air changed as we went deeper, becoming thicker, humid, carrying that same strange smell I'd noticed earlier, but stronger now. The walls of the corridor were different too, covered in a thin film of moisture that glistened under our flashlights. The temperature's rising, Reeves noted, checking a thermometer on his gear. We're 10 degrees warmer than the level above. Should be getting colder the deeper we go, Morris said. Not warmer. The maintenance tunnel narrowed as we progressed, forcing us to proceed in single file. The walls were close enough to touch on either side, and in some places we had to crouch to continue forward. The sensation of being buried alive prickled at the back of my neck, but I pushed it down. Focus on the mission. We'd been moving for about 20 minutes when we heard it, a low, pulsing hum that vibrated through the metal around us. It wasn't mechanical. It wavered and fluctuated in patterns too irregular for machinery. That's it, Russell whispered. The signal. They've already started. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger space, a junction where several passages converged. The humming was louder here, coming from a passage directly ahead, but that wasn't what stopped us in our tracks. The walls were covered in a strange, web-like growth that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. It spread across the ceiling and floor, thicker in some places than others, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like circuit boards or neural networks. Don't touch it, Russell warned. The growth is a physical manifestation of the signal. Direct contact could trigger transformation. As if to emphasize his point, we noticed shapes embedded in the thicker sections of the growth, human shapes, partially absorbed into the web-like structure. Their features were distorted, mouths frozen in silent screams, limbs elongated and fused with the growth around them. Jesus, Morris breathed, then caught himself. Sorry. I recognized one of the faces, or what was left of it. That's Kendrick. His body was half absorbed into the wall, one arm still free but transformed, the fingers unnaturally long and jointed. His eyes were open but clouded over, unseeing. Is he? Bennett couldn't finish the question. Russell shook his head. He's part of it now. They all are. The humming intensified, pulsing through the air, around us. With each wave, the growth on the walls seemed to expand slightly, reaching further along the tunnels. It's spreading, I realized. The signal is strengthening the growth, and the growth is amplifying the signal. It's a feedback loop. We need to move, Russell urged. Sector 7 is just ahead. We need to destroy the transmission equipment before the signal reaches full strength. We pressed forward, careful not to touch the walls. The passage leading to Sector 7 was almost completely overtaken by the growth, leaving only a narrow path down the center. The humming had become a physical presence, pressing against our ears and vibrating through our bodies. The door to Sector 7 was massive, a reinforced blast door designed to contain whatever was inside. It stood partially open, a gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. Beyond it, bright light pulsed in rhythm with the humming. Charges on the transmission equipment, I ordered Morris. We blow it and get out, quick and clean. He nodded, readying the explosives we'd brought. Bennett and Reeves positioned themselves to provide cover, while Russell hovered near the door, his eyes fixed on his tablet as he monitored the signal strength. It's spiking, he warned. Whatever they're doing in there, they're reaching some kind of crescendo. I peered through the gap in the door. The room beyond was vast, its walls entirely covered in the luminescent growth. In the center stood what appeared to be the source of the light, a column of energy that stretched from floor to ceiling, pulsing with colors that hurt to look at directly. Around the column, the creatures moved in a strange, synchronized dance. There were dozens of them, their elongated bodies weaving in and out of the light. They weren't random mutations as I'd first thought, but precisely engineered forms. Some had multiple limbs that ended in delicate, tool-like appendages. Others had what looked like specialized sensory organs protruding from their torsos. And at the base of the column, partially emerged from the growth on the floor, was something else, larger than the others, its form more fully transformed. It barely resembled anything human, its body a complex arrangement of limbs and sensory organs wrapped around a central mass. It seemed to be directing the others, its movements dictating the rhythm of their dance. That's the primary receiver, Russell whispered, pointing to the large creature. It's channeling the signal through itself, directing the others to amplify and transmit. Can we kill it? I asked. Destroy the equipment, he replied. The column is the transmitter. Without it, the signal can't propagate. We found it at the entrance to one of the sealed-off underground tunnels. The door was half open despite the fact that it should have been locked tight. Inside, the light flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. That's when we saw it. At first glance, it looked like a pile of bones, old and weathered, but then I realized the bones were fresh, too fresh, and they weren't animal bones. Russell backed up fast, muttering under his breath. I stepped forward, reaching down to inspect the remains. There was something strange about the way they were scattered, almost as if they had been arranged. That's when the stench hit me. It was sharp, metallic, like blood mixed with rust. Morris was the first to notice the movement. I barely had time to register his shout before something shot out of the shadows. It was fast, too fast. Morris went down hard, his body dragged into the darkness before anyone could react. I've seen a lot in my time, but nothing moved like that, and I wasn't about to let another one of my team get taken. I ordered the rest of us to fall back, but the thing didn't give us a chance. It came at us again, this time from the ceiling, dropping down with a sickening thud. We opened fire, but it was like shooting at smoke. It darted through the bullets, a blur of movement and sharp angles. That's when I got my first good look at it. It was big, at least 7 feet tall when it stood up, but it was hunched over, its back arched like a spider. Its limbs were long, too long, and twisted at odd angles. It had skin, or something close to it, but it was stretched too tight over its bones, making it look like it had been pulled from some ancient tomb, and its mouth, if you could call it that, was filled with rows of jagged, crooked teeth. It moved like a snake, slithering over the ground in a way that didn't make sense for something so large. I didn't know what it was, and I wasn't about to stick around and find out. Russell was useless at that point, mumbling about how it couldn't be real, how none of this made sense. He was right, but now wasn't the time for existential breakdowns. We needed to get out fast. Morris was gone, and I wasn't about to lose anyone else. We fell back, firing at the thing to keep it at bay. It seemed to be toying with us, letting us think we had a chance. We barely made it to the entrance when I felt something grab my leg. I went down hard, smashing my knee against the concrete. I looked back, and there it was, dragging itself toward me, its long fingers curled around my boot. I kicked at it, but its grip was like iron. I fired point blank into its face. The thing screamed, a horrible, bone-rattling noise that made my head spin, but it let go. We didn't stop running until we were back outside, the cold air slapping us awake. Russell collapsed in the snow, gasping for breath. I looked around, expecting it to follow us, but the thing stayed inside. It didn't come after us. That's when I noticed the second set of footprints. They weren't ours, and they weren't human. They led away from the outpost, heading deep into the woods, like the thing had friends out there, waiting for us to come to them. I wasn't about to give it that chance. We need to go back in, I said, after we'd caught our breath. The statement hung in the frigid air between us, drawing looks of disbelief from Bennett and Reeves. You saw what happened to Morris, Bennett protested, and Kendrick. We're outmatched. And outgunned, Reeves added. Our weapons barely slowed that thing down. Russell had recovered somewhat, though his face remained pale. The staff sergeant is right. If we don't destroy the transmission equipment, whatever signal they're sending will only grow stronger. It could spread beyond the facility. How far? I asked. Theoretically, unlimited range. The original signal came from deep space. There's no reason to think the response wouldn't reach just as far. The implications sank in. This wasn't just about a few missing soldiers anymore, or even about what happened to Morris and Kendrick. If that signal reached its destination, whatever had happened here could happen elsewhere, perhaps everywhere. We go back, I decided. But not the same way. Russell, you said the original transmission equipment is in Sector 7. Is there another way to access it? He consulted his tablet, fingers trembling slightly as he navigated through the classified schematics. There's a ventilation system that runs throughout the lower levels. It connects to Sector 7 from the east side of the facility. It would be tight but passable. And the explosives? I looked to Bennett, who had taken charge of our demolition gear after Kendrick was lost. We've got enough to bring down the whole sector if we place them right, he confirmed. But we'd need to get close to the core of whatever's generating that signal. I nodded, formulating a plan. We use the ventilation system to bypass the main corridors where those things are patrolling. Get as close as possible to the transmission equipment, plant the charges, and get out. Quick and clean. Those vents will be a kill box if they find us, Reeves pointed out. No room to maneuver, no way to retreat. Then we make sure they don't find us, I said simply. Russell, how much time do we have before that signal reaches full strength? He checked his readings. Based on the energy fluctuations I detected earlier, I'd estimate less than 2 hours. Then we move now. Gear check, weapons, ammo, explosives. Leave behind anything that might slow you down or make noise. We strip down to essential equipment, distributing the explosives between Bennett and me as a precaution. Reeves packed light medical supplies, focusing on items that might counteract whatever transformative effects the signal had on human physiology. Russell kept only his tablet and a small case of specialized equipment I didn't recognize. What's that? I asked, nodding to the case. Signal jammers, he replied. Short range, but they might disrupt the creature's ability to communicate with each other. They operate on a hive mind of sorts. The primary receiver coordinates their actions through subsonic frequencies. Why didn't you mention this earlier? Because using them puts us at risk too. The jammers don't discriminate. They'll affect any technology in range, including our comms, and there's a chance they might agitate the creatures rather than disrupt them. A chance we'll have to take, I decided. We use them only when necessary, and only for short bursts. We re-entered the facility through a maintenance hatch Russell identified from his schematics, bypassing the main entrance where we'd first encountered the creatures. The access led to a utility corridor that smelled of mildew and rust, its walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits. Ventilation access is 50 meters ahead, Russell whispered, leading the way. The shafts are maintenance-sized on this level, but they narrow as they approach Sector 7. The access panel to the ventilation system was partially corroded, its edges crusted with the same strange growth we'd seen in the lower levels, though much less developed here. It took both Bennett and me to pry it open, the metal groaning in protest. The shaft beyond was dark and cramped, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. A faint breeze carried that now familiar smell, metallic and organic at the same time, like ozone mixed with decay. I'll take point, I said, shouldering my rifle and preparing to enter the shaft. Russell, you're next with the tablet. Guide us through this maze. Bennett, then Reeves. Keep it quiet. The ventilation system was a nightmare of tight turns and junctions, the metal walls pressing in from all sides. Our progress was painfully slow, each movement calculated to minimize noise. The further we went, the warmer it became, the air growing thick with moisture that condensed on the shaft walls. And with the heat came the growth. Thin at first, just traces along the seams of the metal, but thickening as we descended. In some places it pulsed with that same bioluminescence we'd seen earlier, casting an eerie blue light through the shaft. We're approaching the 3rd level, Russell whispered, his voice barely audible over the increasing hum that vibrated through the metal around us. Sector 7 is directly below us now. I paused at a junction, peering down a vertical shaft that seemed to drop into darkness. Is that our route? Russell nodded. It leads to a maintenance room adjacent to Sector 7. From there, we can access the main chamber without crossing the areas where the creatures were concentrated. The descent was treacherous, the handholds slick with moisture and growth. Twice I nearly lost my grip, saved only by years of training and raw instinct. Below me, I could hear the others struggling similarly, their breathing heavy in the confined space. The shaft ended at another access panel, this one heavily overgrown with the luminescent material. It bulged inward as if something were pressing against it from the other side, pulsing in rhythm with a now deafening hum. "We need to break through," I said, drawing my combat knife. "But be ready. No telling what's waiting on the other side." I scraped at the growth, trying to clear the edges of the panel. The material was surprisingly resilient, more like cartilage than plant matter, and it seemed to recoil from the blade. When I finally managed to pry the panel loose, a rush of hot, fetid air burst into the shaft, carrying with it a chorus of those clicking sounds we'd heard earlier. The maintenance room beyond was unrecognizable, completely transformed by the growth. It covered every surface, thicker here than anywhere we'd seen before, forming complex structures that resembled organic machinery. Pulsing veins of bioluminescence ran through it, all converging toward a doorway on the far side of the room. "Sector 7 is through there," Russell whispered. "The primary transmission equipment will be in the center of the chamber." We climbed down from the shaft cautiously, avoiding contact with the growth as much as possible. The floor yielded slightly underfoot, like walking on living tissue rather than concrete and metal. "How much of this stuff is there?" Bennett asked, disgust evident in his voice. "It's spread throughout the lower levels," Russell replied, "growing exponentially as the signal strengthens. At this rate, it will encompass the entire facility within days." "Charges here would be ineffective," I noted, surveying the room. "We need to hit the source directly." We approached the doorway, moving as silently as possible despite the yielding floor. Beyond it lay Sector 7 proper, a vast chamber that had once been filled with research equipment but was now almost entirely transformed. The central column of energy I'd glimpsed earlier now dominated the space, a pillar of shifting light that stretched from floor to ceiling. Around it, the creatures moved in their strange, synchronized patterns, more numerous than before. Dozens of the transformed beings, their elongated limbs and distorted bodies weaving through the light in what almost resembled worship. And at the base of the column, partially merged with the growth, was the primary receiver, the largest of the creatures, its body a complex arrangement of sensory organs and limbs. It pulsed in time with the column, its movements directing the others. "The transmission equipment," Russell whispered, pointing to a series of structures embedded in the growth near the column. "It's been absorbed, integrated into their biology, but the core components are still there. That's what we need to destroy." "How close do we need to get?" Bennett asked, readying the explosives. "Within 20 meters for maximum effect," Russell calculated. "Any further and the growth might absorb enough of the blast to protect the essential components." I surveyed the chamber, noting the patterns of movement among the creatures. They seemed focused on the column, their attention directed inward. If we stayed along the periphery of the room, using the growth as cover, we might be able to approach close enough to plant the charges undetected. "We move along the east wall," I decided. "Bennett, prepare 3 charges. Primary target is that equipment cluster. Russell, stand by with the jammers in case we're spotted. Reeves, cover our 6. If anything comes at us from behind, take it down quietly if possible." We began our approach, staying low and using the uneven terrain created by the growth to mask our movements. The creatures remained focused on their ritual, seemingly unaware of our presence. The hum of the transmission grew louder as we neared the column, pressing against our skulls with almost physical force. We were 30 meters from the target when one of the creatures suddenly broke from the group, its elongated head swiveling in our direction. It paused, as if scenting the air, then began moving toward our position with that unnatural fluid motion. "It knows we're here," Bennett whispered, his hand moving to his weapon. "Hold," I ordered. "No noise unless absolutely necessary." The creature drew closer, its body weaving through the growth with disturbing ease. It was one of the smaller ones, its form less fully transformed than others, with vestiges of human features still visible beneath the changes. As it approached, I realized with a shock that I recognized the distorted face. It was Morris, or what had once been Morris. His eyes were now milky white, unseeing in the conventional sense, but clearly perceiving something. The lower half of his face had split into mandible-like structures that clicked rhythmically as he moved. His body had elongated, joints rearranged, skin stretched and pale. He paused just meters from our position, head tilting as if listening. For a moment I thought he might retain some fragment of his former self, some recognition of his team. Then he screamed, a high, piercing sound that cut through the hum of the transmission like a knife. "Now!" I shouted, abandoning stealth as the other creatures turned toward us, alerted by Morris's cry. "Russell! Jammers!" Russell activated his devices, throwing them toward different parts of the chamber. They flared to life with a pulse of energy that disrupted the rhythm of the hum. The effect on the creatures was immediate. They staggered, movements becoming uncoordinated and erratic. We sprinted toward the equipment cluster, firing at any creature that came too close. The bullets seemed more effective now, the jammers apparently weakening whatever force made them so resilient before. "Cover me," Bennett shouted, dropping to one knee as he reached the target area. He worked quickly, attaching the explosive charges to what remained of the original equipment embedded in the growth. The primary receiver at the base of the column was writhing in apparent agony, its many limbs thrashing as the jammers disrupted its connection to the others. But even as we watched, it began to adapt, its movements becoming more purposeful again. "The jammers are losing effectiveness," Russell warned. "We have minutes at most." "Charges set," Bennett called. "Remote detonator ready." "Fall back to the maintenance room," I ordered. "Move." We retreated as the creatures began to recover, their movements regaining that fluid, coordinated quality. The one that had been Morris was in pursuit, leading several others in our direction. They were faster than us, gaining ground with each passing second. "Use the second jammer," I shouted to Russell. He activated another device, tossing it behind us. It bought us precious seconds as the creatures recoiled from its effects, allowing us to reach the maintenance room. "Back into the shaft," I directed, helping Reeves up first. Russell, then Bennett. As they climbed, I held position at the doorway, firing controlled bursts at the advancing creatures. They were moving more cautiously now, spreading out to surround our position rather than rushing in directly. "Staff Sergeant, come on," Bennett called from the shaft. I backed toward the access point, keeping my weapon trained on the doorway. The creatures had paused just beyond the threshold, as if reluctant to enter. The Morris thing was at their center, its head tilted in that strange, evaluating angle. For a brief moment, our eyes met. His milky white, mine wide with adrenaline. And in that instant, I saw something flicker across what remained of his face. Recognition, perhaps, or something else entirely. Then I was in the shaft, pulling the access panel closed behind me. "Go, up, fast as you can." We climbed frantically, the sounds of pursuit echoing through the shaft below us. Claws or something like them scraped against metal, the creatures forcing their way into the ventilation system. "How far to the exit?" I gasped to Russell. 200 meters, he replied. "First junction, then right, straight to the utility corridor." "Bennett, the detonator." He fumbled in his pocket, producing the remote trigger for the explosives. "Ready." "Wait until we reach the junction," I ordered. "We need more distance." The shaft seemed endless, each meter a struggle against gravity and fatigue. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, punctuated by that clicking communication. They were gaining on us, their transformed bodies better adapted to the confined space than our human frames. Finally, we reached the junction, turning right toward the exit as Russell had directed. "Now!" I shouted to Bennett. He pressed the detonator. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world seemed to buckle around us. The explosion ripped through the facility beneath us, the shock wave traveling up through the ventilation system like a solid wall of force. The shaft bucked and twisted, metal shrieking as welds tore free. We were thrown against the walls, tumbling through the suddenly unstable passage. Behind us, the creature screamed, not in pain but in something that sounded disturbingly like triumph. Then the screams were cut short as the shaft behind us collapsed inward, crushed by structural failures cascading through the facility. We crawled desperately toward the exit, the ventilation system crumbling around us. Ahead I could see light, the utility corridor, our way out. "Move," I urged, pushing Reeves ahead of me as a section of shaft behind us gave way. We spilled out into the corridor in a tangle of limbs and equipment, scrambling to our feet as the entire wall shuddered. Cracks raced across the concrete, spreading like lightning from floor to ceiling. "The whole place is coming down," Bennett realized. "We need to get topside." We ran through the buckling corridors, dodging falling debris and equipment. The growth that had spread through the lower levels was reacting to the destruction, writhing and pulsing with agitated light. In some places, it seemed to be trying to shore up failing structures, forming tendrils that stretched across gaps in the concrete. The stairwell to the surface was partially blocked by fallen ceiling panels, forcing us to climb over precariously balanced debris. Above us, emergency lights flashed warnings, the facility's automated systems finally responding to the catastrophic damage. When we reached the main level, the destruction was less severe but still spreading. We sprinted through the entrance hall, burst through the main doors, and kept running until we were clear of the outpost's perimeter. Behind us, the central building collapsed inward with a roar of concrete and metal, dust billowing into the frigid Alaskan air. The outlying structures followed, one by one, as the foundations beneath them gave way. We watched from a safe distance as the facility was reduced to rubble, the snow around it darkening with dust and debris. For several minutes, no one spoke, our breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Did we stop it?" Bennett finally asked. "The transmission?" Russell was checking his tablet, which had somehow survived the escape. "Energy readings are falling rapidly. The primary equipment was destroyed." He looked up, his expression still troubled, but the signal was active for nearly an hour before we intervened, long enough to reach its destination. "And what happens now?" Reeves asked. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. I wasn't about to give them the chance to find us. We radioed for extraction, but by the time help arrived, it was too late for Morris. His body, or what was left of it, was found inside the bunker, torn apart like something had used him for practice. The rescue team arrived 3 hours after our call, a Black Hawk helicopter appearing over the horizon like a mirage. They brought medical personnel, additional security forces, and a team of specialists in hazmat suits who immediately cordoned off the ruins of the outpost. We were separated upon arrival at the nearest military base, each taken to isolated quarters for medical observation. The debriefings began immediately, endless hours of questions from stern-faced officers and civilian specialists whose credentials were never shared. They wanted to know everything: what we'd seen, what we'd heard, what we'd touched. They were particularly interested in any physical contact with the growth or the creatures, scrutinizing every scratch and bruise as if looking for signs of transformation. Russell wasn't among the questioners. In fact, I didn't see him again after we were separated. When I asked about him, I was told he was assisting with containment procedures, whatever that meant. Bennett and Reeves were similarly isolated. During one brief encounter in a corridor between debriefings, Bennett managed to whisper that they'd been running blood tests on him hourly, looking for something they wouldn't specify. He looked haggard, his eyes sunken, the wound on his arm bandaged but clearly still painful. "They know more than they're telling us," he murmured before we were ushered away from each other. "This isn't the first time this has happened." After 3 days of isolation and questioning, I was finally brought before Colonel Harrington, the man who had assigned us the mission in the first place. He looked older than I remembered, his face etched with new lines of worry. "Sit down, Staff Sergeant," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I believe it's time we had a frank discussion." "About what happened at Outpost 37, sir?" I asked, taking the seat. "About what happens next." He slid a folder across the desk, different from the one he'd given me before the mission, thicker and marked with classification levels I'd never seen before. "The official report on the incident." I opened it cautiously. The document inside was heavily redacted, black lines obscuring most of the text. What remained was a clinical account of a containment failure, resulting in the loss of research materials and the deaths of several personnel due to environmental hazards. No mention of the creatures, no mention of the transmission, no mention of Morris or Kendrick being transformed, rather than simply killed. "This is bull, sir," I said, closing the folder. "This isn't what happened." "It's what happened officially," Harrington replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And it's what you'll confirm happened if asked." "And if I don't?" He sighed, suddenly looking very tired. "Quentin, I've known you for a long time. You're one of my best. But what happened at Outpost 37 goes beyond you, beyond me, beyond even the military. Some things are classified not because they're secret, but because people couldn't handle knowing them. People deserve to know if we're not alone," I countered. "If something out there is trying to change us." "Do they?" He leaned forward. "What would happen if word got out that an alien signal can transform humans into something else? The panic, the chaos." He shook his head. "And that's assuming it's alien at all. We don't know what it is, not really. The original researchers thought it came from space, but others believed it might have emerged from somewhere much closer, perhaps from within the Earth itself, from depths we've never explored." I remembered the creatures' movements, their behavior, how they seemed to be conducting some kind of ritual around that column of energy. They were sending a signal back, I realized, calling to whatever sent the original transmission. Harrington nodded slightly. "That's one theory. Another is that they were simply trying to spread, broadcasting the same signal that changed them to affect others elsewhere." "And did they succeed?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Before we destroyed the equipment?" He was silent for a long moment. "We don't know. No similar incidents have been reported, but..." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging between us. "But it could take time," I finished for him. "Days, weeks, months before anything happens, if it happens." "Precisely. He closed the folder, reclaiming it from my side of the desk. Which is why we maintain monitoring stations around the globe, why we keep facilities like Outpost 37 operational despite official decommissioning. We listen, we watch, and when necessary, we contain. And the others? I asked. Bennett? Reeves? They'll be released back to active duty shortly, with appropriate reassignments. Far from Alaska. He gave me a meaningful look. As will you. And Russell? Something flickered across Harrington's face. Discomfort, perhaps, or concern. Intelligence Officer Russell has returned to his regular duties. It was a non-answer, and we both knew it. Sir, with all due respect, we deserve to know if we're at risk. If what happened to Morris and Kendrick could happen to us. Harrington hesitated, then nodded slightly. The medical evaluations show no signs of unusual physiological changes in you or the other survivors. The transformation appears to require either direct exposure to the original signal or prolonged contact with the growth it generates. You had neither. And the growth itself? The ruins of the outpost? Being handled appropriately. Another non-answer. The site has been completely quarantined, and what remains is being systematically sterilized. I wanted to believe him, but the memory of those second set of footprints in the snow lingered. They'd led away from the outpost, into the wilderness. At least one of the creatures had left before we arrived. Perhaps more. The official report will state that you and your team encountered a toxic chemical leak resulting from old Soviet experiments, Harrington continued, that you heroically managed to prevent its spread by triggering a controlled demolition of the facility, but tragically lost 2 men in the process. He met my eyes steadily. Your commendations are being processed. You'll receive the Silver Star for your actions. For a lie, I said quietly. For saving lives, he corrected. Perhaps more than you know. I was dismissed shortly after, given 2 weeks leave before my new assignment, a training post at Fort Bragg, about as far from Alaska as the military could send me, while keeping me in the continental United States. Bennett and Reeves received similar reassignments, each to different locations. We were being separated, our shared experience buried along with the truth about Outpost 37. The official report said Morris died in an accident. That's how they always explain it, just another casualty of a training exercise gone wrong. But we knew better. A few days later, Russell disappeared. No one could find him. They said he probably ran, couldn't handle the stress, but I don't think that's what happened. I think whatever was out there got him. Or perhaps he found something in those classified files he couldn't live with, or couldn't live without. And I think it's still out there, waiting for someone else to show up. The thing about Alaska is that it doesn't care if you're prepared, if you're trained, if you think you know what's coming. It'll take you anyway, leave you frozen and forgotten, like Morris. And Kendrick, and maybe Russell too. I never went back. Whatever they sent to clean up that place, I don't want to know how it ended. Some things are better left buried. I figure if I ever hear another one of those transmissions, I'll just turn off the radio. There are some calls you don't need to answer. But sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I find myself listening, really listening, to the spaces between stations, to the static and white noise that most people ignore, listening for patterns, for rhythms that shouldn't be there. For clicking sounds like the ones we heard in those corridors. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear them, faint but growing stronger, like something calling from very far away, or getting closer. And as for Morris, well, if there's one upside to this whole mess, it's that the guy owed me $20. Guess I won't have to worry about collecting on that. But in the darkest moments, when I'm honest with myself, I know that debt might come due in other ways. The footprints leading away from the outpost haunt me still. Whatever we encountered there, whatever we briefly contained, it isn't over. It's just waiting, calling, transforming. I check my skin sometimes, looking for changes, for signs that something has begun to alter me from within. So far, nothing. But the night is long, and the signal, I fear, travels farther than we know. The delivery order came in late on a Tuesday, stamped with that red, urgent mark that meant someone upstate was running low on essentials. I'd been doing supply runs for the Forest Service for 3 years, and I knew the drill. Most of the time it was routine stuff. Batteries for the radio equipment, medical supplies, rations that could last through a storm. The rangers stationed at the remote lookouts depended on guys like me to keep them connected to civilization. But this particular order felt different from the moment I saw the destination, Tug Hollow Watch Station. I'd only been out there twice before, both times during broad daylight with Kevin riding shotgun. Kevin was one of the senior drivers, a guy who'd been making these mountain runs since before GPS was standard equipment. He knew every unmarked trail, every seasonal bridge, every spot where the road liked to wash out after heavy rain. More importantly, he knew which places you just didn't go to alone. Tug Hollow was one of those places. The station sat deep in the Appalachian backcountry, past mile marker 42, where the paved road surrendered to gravel and the forest started reclaiming what man had tried to carve out. It was an old fire lookout, one of the original wooden towers built back in the 1940s when the service still believed in posting human eyes to watch for smoke. Most of those towers had been abandoned decades ago, replaced by satellite monitoring and aerial surveillance, but a few still stood, manned by rangers who preferred the isolation to the politics of the main stations. According to the work order, the ranger up there, listed only as Thomas, had called in requesting a replacement battery for his radio equipment and backup rations. Standard stuff. The order was signed off by Regional Supervisor Michael Patterson, and it carried the usual note: coordinate with station personnel upon arrival. What bothered me wasn't the request itself, but the timing. The call had come in on Sunday, but the order didn't get processed until Tuesday afternoon. That meant Thomas had been sitting up there for 2 days with a dead radio, completely cut off from the outside world. In this business, communication blackouts were serious. Rangers were supposed to check in twice daily, and when they didn't, search and rescue teams got dispatched. But no SAR team had been called for Tug Hollow. I loaded the supplies into my truck just as the afternoon shift was ending. The battery was a heavy bastard, the kind used for emergency broadcasting equipment, and the rations consisted of enough canned goods and freeze-dried meals to last 2 weeks. I also threw in a first aid kit and an emergency flare gun, standard protocol for remote deliveries. Samuel, the loading dock supervisor, watched me secure everything with bungee cords. "You sure you want to head up there this late?" he asked, glancing at the sky. "Weather report's calling for fog tonight." "I've got headlights," I said, but even as I said it, I felt that familiar twist in my stomach. Samuel had been with the service longer than anyone, and when he expressed concern about weather, you listened. "It's not just fog up there," he continued, lowering his voice like he didn't want the other drivers to hear. "That whole area, there's been strange reports, animals acting weird, hikers getting turned around in places they've been 100 times before." "What kind of reports?" Samuel hesitated, then shook his head. "Probably nothing, but David from SAR mentioned they've had to pull 3 separate search operations out of that sector in the past month. People who went missing for days, then turned up miles from where they started, with no memory of how they got there." "Did they find everyone?" 2 out of 3. I drove north on Highway 26, watching the sun sink behind the ridgeline. The radio crackled with the usual end-of-shift chatter, drivers checking in, dispatchers coordinating tomorrow's routes, weather updates that painted an increasingly grim picture for the overnight hours. By the time I reached mile marker 35, the static was thick enough that I switched the radio off entirely. The paved road ended at marker 40, just like always. From there it was 7 miles of gravel and dirt that twisted up the mountainside like a scar. The truck handled it well enough, but I had to take it slow. One wrong turn up here, and you could end up nose down in a ravine with no cell service and no hope of rescue until someone noticed you were missing. Which, given the communications blackout at Tug Hollow, might be longer than usual. The fog started rolling in around mile marker 42, just thick wisps at first, like smoke from a distant campfire. But it thickened fast, the way mountain fog does when the temperature drops and the humidity rises. Within 10 minutes, my headlights could barely penetrate 20 feet ahead. I slowed to a crawl, following the pale ribbon of gravel that was my only guide through the gray wall. That's when I noticed the trees. They were wrong. Not dead or diseased, just wrong. The branches hung too low, reaching toward the road like gnarled fingers. The bark looked slick with moisture, even though it hadn't rained in 3 days. And everywhere I looked, I saw marks, deep scratches in the tree trunks, too high and too wide to be from any animal I could name. The truck's heater was running full blast, but I still felt cold. I reached the turnoff for Tug Hollow just after 6 p.m. The sign was there, barely visible through the fog. Tug Hollow Watch Station, Bona's 1.5 miles, Bona's authorized personnel only. Someone had scratched out the last line with what looked like a key or a knife, leaving deep gouges in the metal. The dirt track leading to the station was worse than I remembered. The spring runoff had carved new gullies across the path, and fallen branches lay scattered like bones. My truck bounced and lurched over the uneven terrain, the supply crates sliding around in the back despite the restraints. But it was the silence that really got to me. The forest should have been alive with sound. Birds calling to roost, insects buzzing in the underbrush, small animals rustling through the leaf litter. Instead, there was nothing, just the growl of my engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Even the fog seemed to muffle sound, creating a dead zone where normal forest noises simply ceased to exist. I'd gone maybe half a mile when the truck lurched to one side and died. The engine just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. I tried the ignition but got nothing, not even a click. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive, and in the sudden silence I could hear my own heartbeat. I popped the hood and checked the battery connections, though I couldn't see much in the heavy mist. Everything looked normal. The terminals were clean, the belts were tight, and there was plenty of fluid in all the reservoirs. But when I tried the engine again, it was completely dead, which left me with two choices: sit in the truck until morning and hope someone came looking, or hike the remaining mile to the station with the supplies. The battery alone weighed 40 pounds. The rest of the gear would add another 60. In the fog, on unfamiliar terrain, carrying that much weight could be suicide, but sitting in a dead truck in the middle of nowhere seemed just as dangerous. I decided to make the hike. I loaded the supplies into a backpack and a wheeled cart I kept for situations like this. The cart was a piece of shit, aluminum frame, plastic wheels that liked to jam on anything bigger than a pebble, but it was better than trying to carry everything. I locked the truck, pocketed the keys, and started walking. The fog seemed to have a life of its own. It swirled around me in patterns that made no sense, sometimes thinning enough that I could see 10 or 15 feet ahead, then thickening so fast I couldn't see my own hands. The cart wheels squeaked and clattered over every rock and root, sounding impossibly loud in the dead silence. After 10 minutes, I realized I was lost. The track had simply vanished. One moment I was following clear tire ruts in the dirt. The next I was standing in what looked like virgin forest. I backtracked, searching for the path, but the fog had swallowed every landmark. Trees loomed out of the gray like ghosts, all looking identical, all seeming to lean inward as if trying to trap me in a maze of bark and shadow. I pulled out my phone, hoping for GPS, but the screen showed no signal and no satellite connection. Even the compass app spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. That's when I heard the first sound. It wasn't much, just a faint creaking, like old wood settling, but it came from ahead and to my left, roughly where the station should be. I adjusted course and kept walking, using the sound as a guide. The creaking got louder as I walked. Not just one source now, but multiple points, as if the entire forest was slowly bending under some invisible weight. Branches groaned overhead, and I could hear the wet sound of wood scraping against wood, but I still couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The cart hit something hard and metal, nearly tipping over. I knelt down and felt around until my fingers found a chain-link fence, partially collapsed and tangled with dead vines. Beyond it, barely visible through the fog, I could make out the dark outline of a structure. Tug Hollow Watch Station. But as I got closer, I realized something was very wrong. The building was dark. No lights in the windows, no glow from the radio equipment that should have been running on backup power. The wooden tower that housed the lookout platform swayed gently in a wind I couldn't feel, creating that creaking sound I'd been following. And scattered around the base of the tower, like offerings left for some forest god, were dozens of small objects that glinted dully in my flashlight beam. Bones. All of them small, all of them bleached white, all of them arranged in precise geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. I approached the station slowly, the cart bumping over roots and stones. The front door was closed, but the windows were dark. No smoke from the chimney, no sign of human habitation. I called out, but my voice seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, swallowed by the fog. The bones crunched under my feet as I climbed the wooden steps to the front porch. The porch board sagged under my weight, and something skittered away into the darkness when my flashlight beam swept across the weathered planks. The front door stood slightly ajar, and a wet, organic smell drifted out. Not quite decay, but something close. Something that made my stomach clench. I knocked 3 times, hard enough to make the door frame shake. Forest Service, got your supply delivery. No answer. Just that smell getting stronger, and the sound of something dripping somewhere inside. The door handle was ice cold, even through my work gloves. I gave it a slow push, and the door swung open about halfway before hitting something on the floor. I angled my flashlight through the gap and saw the interior of what had once been a functioning ranger station. Now it looked like a bomb had gone off. The main room was chaos. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, and contents scattered across the floor like Someone had been searching for something specific. Canned goods rolled underfoot, their labels torn off in long strips. The radio equipment lay in pieces, wires cut and circuit boards smashed. But it wasn't random destruction. There was a pattern to it, a method that suggested intelligence rather than animal rage. I squeezed through the doorway and immediately stepped on something that crunched. My flashlight beam revealed a field of broken glass, the remnants of every bottle and jar in the place. But the glass hadn't just been broken, it had been arranged. Thousands of tiny shards formed intricate spiral patterns across the floor, each piece carefully placed to catch and reflect light. The walls were covered in symbols. They weren't carved or painted, they were scratched into the wood with something sharp, deep gouges that had left pale wood shavings scattered below each mark. The symbols themselves made no sense to me, but looking at them made my eyes water and my head ache. They seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't focusing directly on them, like optical illusions made manifest. But what really got my attention was what hadn't been touched. Thomas's personal belongings sat untouched in the corner. His boots were lined up neatly beside the bed, laces still tied. His jacket hung on a hook by the door, clean and pressed. His backpack leaned against the wall, zipper closed and straps buckled. Even his coffee mug sat on the small table, half full of liquid that had long since grown a film of mold. It was as if Thomas had simply vanished mid-routine, leaving his possessions exactly where he'd placed them. I called his name again, louder this time, but the sound seemed to get absorbed by the walls themselves. The station felt empty in a way that went beyond mere absence. It felt abandoned by everything that made a place human. The dripping sound was coming from the back room. I followed it, stepping carefully around the glass patterns, and found the source. The ceiling had a leak, and water was falling steadily into a metal bucket. But the water wasn't clear. It was dark red, almost black, and it left stains on the bucket's rim that looked disturbingly organic. Above the leak, something had been carved into the ceiling beam. The same twisted symbols I'd seen on the walls, but larger and deeper. Fresh wood shavings littered the floor below, suggesting the carving was recent, very recent. I checked the back room more thoroughly. Thomas's sleeping area was undisturbed, bed made, clothes folded, personal items arranged with military precision. But his emergency gear was missing. The radio backup battery, the flare gun, the emergency beacon that every ranger carried. Gone, all of them, along with his service weapon and ammunition. Either Thomas had packed up and left, or someone had taken his gear. The fog outside pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. I could see shapes moving in it, not quite human, not quite animal, but definitely alive. They seemed to circle the station, always staying just at the edge of visibility, always moving when I tried to focus on them. I needed to get out of there. I left the supply crates on the porch as protocol demanded, but I kept the emergency flare gun. If Thomas was alive out there, he might need it. If he wasn't, well, I might need it myself. The fog had thickened even more while I was inside. My flashlight beam couldn't penetrate more than arm's length, and the familiar landmarks I'd used to find the station had vanished completely. The fence, the trail markers, even the cleared area around the building, all swallowed by gray nothing. But there was something else in the fog now. Something that hadn't been there before. A path. It wasn't much, just a break in the vegetation, maybe 3 feet wide, where the underbrush had been trampled down. But it was clear and well-defined, cutting through the forest in a perfectly straight line. The fog seemed thinner along the path, as if something had pushed it aside to create a corridor. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the path hadn't been there when I arrived. Common sense told me to stay put, wait for the fog to lift, and hike back to my truck in the morning. But the station felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl, and the shapes moving in the fog were getting bolder, pressing closer to the windows, and there was something about the path that drew me forward. Not curiosity exactly, but something deeper. A compulsion that felt both alien and familiar. I started walking. The path was easy to follow, even in the fog. The ground was packed hard, as if thousands of feet had walked this route over many years. But there were no footprints in the dirt, no broken twigs or disturbed leaves to suggest recent passage. Just smooth, worn earth that seemed to absorb sound and light alike. After maybe 50 yards, I started finding things. The first was a water bottle, standard Forest Service issue, lying beside the path like it had been carefully placed there. The label was partially torn off, but I could make out part of a name. Eomas. Thomas's bottle, almost certainly. But it looked old, weathered, as if it had been lying there for months rather than days. 50 yards further, I found a torn piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush. Green and brown camouflage, the same pattern used in ranger uniforms. The tier was fresh. I could still see loose threads where it had been ripped from whatever it belonged to. Then came the whistle. It was bright orange, the kind issued to all Forest Service personnel for emergency signaling. Standard protocol was to keep it on a lanyard around your neck at all times while on duty. This one lay in the exact center of the path, as if someone had dropped it while running. I picked it up and immediately wished I hadn't. The whistle was warm, not just warm from sitting in the sun, genuinely warm, as if someone had been breathing on it moments before. And there was something sticky on the mouthpiece, something dark that I didn't want to identify. The fog began to thin as I continued down the path, not clearing entirely, but becoming patchy enough that I could see further ahead. The forest on either side looked different here, older, wilder, with trees that seemed too large for their species, and undergrowth that grew in unnatural patterns. And everywhere I looked, I saw more evidence of passage. A flashlight, its lens cracked but still glowing faintly. A piece of rope, cut cleanly as if with a very sharp knife. A single boot, size 11, filled with something dark and wet that I didn't investigate closely. Then I found the shirt. It hung from a branch about 7 feet off the ground, torn down the front and missing both sleeves. Forest Service brown, with name tape that read Thomas in block letters. The fabric was stained with something dark, and there were holes in it that looked like they might have been made by claws or teeth. But the worst part was how it had been displayed. Not caught on the branch accidentally, but deliberately hung there with a piece of wire threaded through the collar. Like a trophy, like a warning, like bait. That's when I realized I wasn't alone on the path. The sound started small, just the faint rustle of leaves behind me, the soft snap of a twig underfoot. Normal forest sounds, the kind you'd expect from small animals moving through the underbrush. But when I stopped to listen, the sounds stopped too. When I resumed walking, they started again, always staying just behind me, always at the very edge of hearing. I was being followed. I quickened my pace, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was tracking me. The path continued straight ahead, cutting through the forest with unnatural precision. No curves, no deviations around trees or boulders, just a perfect line that seemed to have been burned through the wilderness. The fog grew thicker again, pressing close like a living thing. My flashlight beam died just a few feet ahead, swallowed by the gray wall. But I could still see the path clearly, as if it generated its own dim illumination. The packed earth seemed to glow faintly, providing just enough light to follow. More items appeared along the way, scattered like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. A compass with its needle spinning wildly, a field notebook with pages torn out, the remaining sheets covered in frantic handwriting that became increasingly illegible. A radio, its case cracked open and circuitry exposed to the elements. And then I found something that made my blood freeze. A human tooth. It lay in the center of the path, stark white against the dark earth. An adult molar, with the root still attached and bits of pink tissue clinging to the base. Fresh, very fresh. So fresh that, when I knelt to examine it more closely, I could still see blood pooling in the tiny indentations of the crown. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The sounds behind me had stopped, but I could feel eyes watching from the fog. Multiple sets of eyes, patient and predatory. The path began to descend, following the contour of a steep slope. The trees closed in overhead, forming a canopy so thick that even the fog couldn't penetrate. My flashlight beam revealed more disturbing details. Scratches in tree bark that looked like claw marks, branches broken at heights no normal animal could reach, and strange symbols carved into trunks at regular intervals. The symbols were the same ones I'd seen in the station, but here they were older, weathered by years of exposure. Some trees had dozens of them, layered over each other like a palimpsest of madness, and they seemed to tell a story, though I couldn't read the language they were written in. Then the path opened into a clearing. It was perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with the path entering on one side and continuing out the other. The ground was bare earth, packed smooth as concrete and stained dark with something that wasn't mud. Around the perimeter, objects hung from the trees like macabre Christmas ornaments. Bones, hundreds of them, suspended on lengths of wire and sinew. Not just animal bones. I could see human skulls mixed in with deer antlers and bird skeletons. They turned slowly in the still air, clicking against each other with a sound like wind chimes made of death. In the center of the clearing stood a single post, roughly 8 feet tall and carved from what looked like a massive femur. Symbols covered every inch of its surface, so densely packed they seemed to writhe and shift in my flashlight beam. And at the base of the post, arranged in a careful spiral, were more teeth. Dozens of them, human and animal mixed together, all of them stained with fresh blood. The sounds behind me had returned, but closer now, much closer. I could hear breathing that wasn't quite human, and the soft sound of bare feet on earth. Multiple sets of feet moving in coordination like pack hunters. I needed to keep moving. The path continued on the far side of the clearing, but it was different now. Narrower, less defined, as if it was reverting to natural forest trail. The fog thinned again, and I caught glimpses of the terrain ahead, rocky, broken ground that fell away into a steep ravine. More evidence appeared, but it was different now. Less organized, more scattered. A broken compass, torn clothing, scattered equipment that looked like it had been discarded in haste. And blood. Dark stains on rocks and tree trunks that were still wet to the touch. The path ended at the edge of a cliff. I stood at the rim, looking down into a ravine maybe 50 feet deep. The fog filled the bottom like a lake of gray water, but I could see dark shapes moving beneath it, large shapes too big to be human. A crude rope ladder had been tied to a tree and dropped over the edge. The ropes were new, but they were stained with the same dark substance I'd been seeing throughout the forest. And halfway down, something was caught in the strands. A finger. Human. Adult. Severed at the second knuckle. The nail was broken and dirty, as if the owner had been clawing at something before the amputation. It hung from the rope like a grotesque ornament, slowly twisting in the humid air. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit had stopped, but I could feel them there, watching from the tree line, waiting, and I began to understand that this was all planned. The path, the evidence, the clearing, it was all designed to lead me here, to this cliff, to this decision. I could climb down into the ravine and face whatever was waiting in the fog below, or I could turn around and face whatever was waiting in the forest behind me. Neither option seemed likely to end well. That's when I heard the voice. It came from below, muffled by the fog, but clearly human. Male, adult, calling for help in a voice hoarse with exhaustion and terror. "Please, someone help me. I'm trapped down here." Thomas. It had to be Thomas. The voice came again, more urgent now. "I can see your light. Please, they're coming back. You have to help me." I played my flashlight beam down into the ravine, trying to penetrate the fog. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a pale shape that might have been a person waving their arms. The voice called out again, and this time I was sure. It was coming from the bottom of the cliff. I grabbed the rope ladder and tested its strength. It held my weight, though the crude knots creaked ominously. The stains on the rope were sticky and warm, and I tried not to think about what they might be. The descent was treacherous. The rope ladder swayed and twisted with every movement, and the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The walls of the ravine were slick with moisture and covered in the same strange symbols I'd seen throughout the forest. But these were different, fresher, as if they'd been carved recently. And they seemed to be watching me. Halfway down, my foot slipped on a wet rung and I nearly lost my grip. As I steadied myself, something brushed against my face, the severed finger, still hanging from the rope. It was cold and clammy, and when it touched my cheek, I swear I felt it twitch. The bottom of the ravine was worse than I'd imagined. The fog was thinner here, revealing a landscape that looked like something from a nightmare. The ground was covered in bones, not arranged in patterns like the clearing above, but scattered randomly as if discarded after feeding. Skulls grinned from dark corners, and rib cages jutted from the earth like the remains of some massive graveyard. And moving through it all, barely visible in the pale light of my flashlight, were things that had once been human. They were naked, covered in mud and filth, their skin the color of old parchment. Hair hung in matted tangles, and their fingernails had grown into claws, but it was their eyes that horrified me most. Still human, still aware, but filled with a hunger that was anything but civilized. There were 3 of them that I could see, crouched low among the bones like animals waiting to spring. One wore a necklace of fingers, still fresh enough that I could see the wedding ring on one of them. Another had symbols carved into its forehead, deep gashes that wept constantly. The third one was holding something in its hands, something round and pale that it lifted to its mouth and bit into with a wet, crunching sound. A human head. Thomas's head, his ranger hat still somehow perched on top at a jaunty angle. That's when I realized the voice calling for help hadn't been coming from Thomas at all. It had been coming from the thing that was eating him. The creatures saw me at the same time I saw them. For a moment we all froze, predator and prey sizing each other up in the dim light. Then the one with Thomas's head smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points, and made a sound that was part growl, part whistle. The sound echoed off the ravine walls, and more shapes emerged from the fog. Dozens of them, moving with the fluid grace of pack hunters. Some walked upright, others moved on all fours. All of them had once been human, but whatever they'd become was something else entirely. Something hungry. I started climbing back up the rope ladder as fast as I could move. The ladder swayed wildly as I climbed, my flashlight beam dancing across the ravine walls in crazy patterns. Below me, the creatures let out a chorus of sounds. Clicking, whistling, something that might have been laughter. They weren't following me up the cliff, and that terrified me more than if they had been. It meant they knew something I didn't. It meant they had another way up. I was maybe 20 feet from the top when I heard the sounds from above. Scratching, scraping, the sound of claws on stone. My flashlight beam swept upward and caught a glimpse of pale flesh disappearing over the cliff edge. They were already up there, waiting for me. I was trapped between two groups of them, hanging on a rope ladder 50 feet above a bone-strewn killing ground. The logical thing would have been to climb back down, try to find another way out of the ravine. But logic seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. The creatures below were spreading out, positioning themselves under the ladder. If I fell, they'd be ready. I kept climbing. The sounds from above grew louder, more scratching, and something that sounded like whispered conversation in a language I didn't recognize. My flashlight died just as I reached the top, plunging me into darkness so complete it felt solid. I hauled myself over the edge blindly, expecting to feel claws rake across my back at any moment. Instead, I found myself alone at the cliff edge. The forest around me was silent, empty of the sounds that had been following me. But I could smell them, a rank, animal odor mixed with something sweeter, something rotting. I fumbled for my backup flashlight and switched it on. The beam revealed the clearing where I'd entered the forest, but it looked different now. The bone ornaments hung motionless in the still air, and the symbols on the central post seemed to pulse with their own faint light. But the clearing wasn't empty. They stood at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. I could see them only as pale shapes in the darkness, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The one in the center stepped forward into the light. It had been human once, maybe even recently. Female, middle-aged, wearing the tattered remains of hiking clothes. But her face was wrong, stretched and elongated, with teeth that protruded past her lips. Her fingernails had grown into claws, and symbols had been carved into her arms and chest. Fresh symbols, still bleeding. Around her neck hung a collection of objects I recognized. A ranger's badge, a radio, a whistle, and a pair of dog tags that caught the light as she moved. She opened her mouth and spoke, and her voice was exactly the one that had called for help from the bottom of the ravine. "Please," she said, in Thomas's voice. "Someone help me. I'm trapped down here." Then she laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. The others stepped forward into the light. There were at least a dozen of them, all in various stages of transformation from human to something else. Some still walked upright, clinging to the last vestiges of civilization. Others had surrendered completely to whatever they'd become, moving on all fours with predatory grace. But all of them had been human once, and all of them remembered just enough of their former selves to make the imitation convincing. The leader, the woman with Thomas's equipment, tilted her head and studied me with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. When she spoke again, it was in a different voice. Younger, male, desperate. "Help, I'm lost. Can anyone hear me?" One of the others took up the call, but in yet another voice. "I'm hurt. I need medical attention." Then another. "My radio's dead. Can someone guide me back to the trail?" They were voices of the lost, the missing, the ones who'd wandered into the forest and never come out. The voices they used to lure new victims into their territory. And I realized, with a horror that made my knees weak, that somewhere among those stolen voices was my own name being called. My own voice, speaking words I'd never said. They had been watching me longer than I'd thought. The woman stepped closer, and I could see details I wished I couldn't. The symbols carved into her flesh weren't random. They formed words in that alien script I'd been seeing throughout the forest. And they were moving, shifting, and changing as I watched, writing and rewriting themselves across her skin. "You brought supplies," she said, now using her own voice, or what remained of it. The words came out wrong, as if she'd forgotten how human speech was supposed to work. "We need supplies." "Where's Thomas?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. She smiled, revealing too many teeth. "Thomas is here. Thomas is always here. Thomas is part of us now." She gestured to the ornaments hanging from the trees, and I saw what I'd missed before. Mixed in with the bones and skulls were more recent additions. A ranger hat, a utility belt, a name tag that caught the light. Thomas hadn't just been killed, he'd been incorporated. You can be part of us too, the woman continued. You can be part of the forest, part of the family. The others began to move, spreading out to surround me. They moved with purpose, cutting off escape routes, herding me toward the center of the clearing, toward the bone post with its spiral of teeth. I pulled out the flare gun I'd taken from my truck. The woman saw it and laughed again. That won't help you. Nothing helps here. This is our place, our home. Maybe, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But it'll sure as hell hurt. I aimed at the bone post and fired. The flare struck the carved femur and exploded in a burst of red light. The symbols carved into the bone began to smoke and sizzle, and the creatures let out a collective shriek that sounded like rusty metal being torn apart. They recoiled from the light, covering their eyes and stumbling backward. The woman who'd been speaking looked at me with something that might have been respect. Clever, she said, but temporary. She was right. The flare would burn for maybe 5 minutes, and I had no more ammunition. When the light died, they'd be on me. I ran. Behind me, I could hear them recovering, organizing, beginning pursuit. But they weren't rushing. They knew the forest better than I did, knew every trail and hiding place. They could afford to be patient. I crashed through the underbrush, following what I hoped was the path back to the station. But in the darkness, everything looked the same. Trees loomed out of the night like twisted guardians, and every shadow might hide something with claws and too many teeth. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, not just the woman and her pack, but others. The forest seemed to be coming alive around me, filled with shapes that moved just beyond the edge of vision. They were herding me again, driving me toward something. I burst out of the tree line and saw the station ahead, its windows still dark. But between me and safety were more of them. They stood in a loose semicircle around the building, blocking every approach, silent, patient, waiting. The woman emerged from the forest behind me, no longer trying to maintain any pretense of humanity. She moved like a spider, all wrong angles and predatory grace. The others followed, until I was surrounded by at least 20 of them. The station won't help you, she said. It's ours now. It's been ours for a long time. She was right again. Looking at the building more closely, I could see the symbols carved into its walls, the bone ornaments hanging from the eaves. The place had been claimed, marked, incorporated into their territory. How long? I asked, stalling for time while I tried to think of a way out. Since the first one came, she replied. The first ranger. He was so lonely, so isolated. He heard our voices in the forest and came to find us. We welcomed him, made him part of the family. And Thomas? Thomas was the latest, but not the last. She smiled, and I saw myself reflected in her predatory eyes. Saw the future she had planned for me. That's when I heard the sound of an engine. My truck. Somehow, impossibly, my truck was running. I could see headlights cutting through the fog, moving up the access road toward the station. The creatures heard it too, and for the first time since I'd encountered them, they seemed uncertain. The woman snarled something in that alien language, and several of the pack melted back into the forest. But she stayed, along with half a dozen others, enough to finish what they'd started. The truck pulled up to the station and stopped. The engine died, and the driver's door opened. Samuel stepped out. Not exactly Samuel. This version moved wrong, spoke in a voice that was almost right but not quite. And when the headlights hit him at the right angle, I could see through his skin to the bones underneath. Time to go, he said, in Samuel's voice but with someone else's cadence. Supply runs over. The woman looked from him to me, and something passed between them. Some kind of negotiation in a language of glances and subtle movements. Next time, she said finally. Next time you won't have help. She turned and melted back into the forest, taking her pack with her. Within seconds they were gone, leaving me alone with whatever was wearing Samuel's face. Get in the truck, not Samuel said. We have a schedule to keep. I got in the truck. The ride back down the mountain passed in a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. Whatever was driving my truck wore Samuel's appearance perfectly. Same weathered hands on the steering wheel, same unconscious habit of checking the mirrors every few seconds, same way of hunching forward slightly when navigating a difficult turn. But it wasn't Samuel. Couldn't be Samuel. Samuel was back at the depot, probably finishing his paperwork and getting ready to head home to his wife and kids. Wasn't he? I tried to remember the last time I'd seen Samuel clearly. Earlier that evening, loading the supplies? Or was it yesterday? The memories felt slippery, unreliable, as if something was editing them in real time. Fog's lifting, not Samuel said, using exactly Samuel's voice. Should be clear by morning. I looked out the window. He was right. The gray wall that had trapped me in the forest was beginning to dissipate, revealing familiar landmarks. The road, the mile markers, the civilized world I'd left behind what felt like hours ago. But had it been hours? My watch had stopped at 11:47, though I couldn't remember when. The truck's dashboard clock showed 6:23 a.m., but that seemed impossible. I'd started the hike to the station around 7 in the evening. Had I really been in the forest for 11 hours? Time moves different up there, Not Samuel said, as if reading my thoughts. Always has. That's why we don't send people alone anymore. We? He glanced at me with eyes that might have been Samuel's. The service. Department policy. Remote deliveries require two-person teams. Has for years. That wasn't true. I'd made dozens of solo runs, including 2 previous trips to Tug Hollow. But when I tried to recall the specific details, they slipped away like smoke. Had Kevin been with me before? Had I ever actually been to Tug Hollow alone? The uncertainty was worse than the terror I'd felt in the forest. We reached the main highway as dawn broke over the mountains. The familiar landscape looked normal. Gas stations, billboards, the detritus of civilization that marked the boundary between the wild places and the human world. But everything felt thin somehow, like a stage set that might collapse if I looked too closely. Not Samuel pulled into a 24-hour diner and parked. "Coffee," he said. "Need coffee." We went inside, and the fluorescent lights felt like salvation after the darkness of the forest. The waitress, a tired-looking woman named Diane, according to her name tag, poured coffee without being asked and left menus we didn't touch. "You look like hell," Not Samuel said, stirring sugar into his cup with Samuel's habitual precision. "Rough night?" I studied his face, looking for some tell, some sign that he wasn't what he appeared to be. But everything was perfect. The crow's feet around his eyes, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident he'd told me about, even the way he held his coffee cup. "The station," I said carefully. "It was abandoned." "Tug Hollow?" He frowned, a perfect replica of Samuel's expression when he was thinking. "Yeah, we decommissioned that place 3 weeks ago. Budget cuts. Should have been on your route sheet." I pulled out the work order, the one that had sent me to deliver supplies to Thomas. But the paper was blank. Not empty. Actually blank, as if it had never been printed on. "Must have been a computer error," Not Samuel continued. "Happens sometimes. Old data in the system. Automated orders for stations that don't exist anymore." "What about Thomas?" "Thomas?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Don't know any Thomas. We've got a Timothy up at Ravens Ridge and a William at Bear Creek. But no Thomas." The coffee tasted like nothing. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and outside the window normal people went about their normal lives. But I felt like I was watching it all through thick glass, separated from reality by something I couldn't name. "I should file a report," I said. "About what?" "A delivery to a closed station. Happens all the time. Just mark it as undeliverable and move on." He finished his coffee and left money on the table. "Come on, gotta get you back for the morning shift briefing." The drive to the depot passed in a blur. Normal traffic, normal radio chatter, normal conversations between normal people. By the time we pulled into the parking lot, I was beginning to doubt my own memories. Had I really encountered those things in the forest? Or had I gotten lost in the fog, panicked, and imagined the whole thing? But when I got out of the truck, I found something in my pocket that shouldn't have been there. A human tooth. Small, white, with bits of tissue still clinging to the root. I looked at Not Samuel, but he was already walking toward the depot building, moving with Samuel's familiar gait. He turned back once and waved, a gesture so perfectly Samuel that my doubts started to crumble. Maybe it had been Samuel all along. Maybe I was losing my mind. I threw the tooth in a dumpster and went inside to file my report. The morning briefing was normal. Samuel was there, looking exactly like himself, showing no signs of having spent the night rescuing me from forest cannibals. He gave me a concerned look when I walked in late, but said nothing. "Rough night?" asked Kevin, the senior driver. "You look like hell." "Computer error," I said, using the explanation Not Samuel had given me. "Got sent to a closed station." "Tug Hollow." Samuel looked up from his clipboard. "Yeah, we shut that place down weeks ago. Should have caught that in the system update." I stared at him. Same voice, same mannerisms, same small scar on his chin. But something in his eyes, something that might have been amusement. "You okay?" Kevin asked. "You look pale." "Fine," I lied. "Just tired." I tried to focus on the briefing. on the normal routine of delivery schedules and weather reports. But my mind kept drifting back to the forest, to the creatures that wore human faces and spoke with stolen voices. When the briefing ended, I checked my truck. The supplies I'd taken to Tug Hollow were gone, of course. I'd left them on the station porch. But there was no mud on the tires, no scratches on the paint from the rough forest road. The truck looked like it had been sitting in the depot parking lot all night. I found Michael Patterson, the regional supervisor, in his office. "I need to ask about Tug Hollow Watch Station," I said. He looked up from his computer. "What about it? When exactly was it decommissioned?" Patterson frowned and pulled up something on his screen. "Let's see. Tug Hollow was officially closed on June 15th. That's 3 weeks ago. Why? Who was the last ranger stationed there?" More typing. "Looks like nobody. Station's been automated for the past 5 years. Just weather monitoring equipment. No ranger named Thomas?" "Thomas?" Patterson's frown deepened. "We don't have anyone named Thomas on the roster. Never have, as far as I can see." He turned his monitor so I could see the screen. "Personnel records going back 10 years. No Thomas." "Are you feeling all right?" Patterson asked. "You look a little shaky." I was more than shaky. I was starting to think I was losing my mind. But that afternoon, I got a call that changed everything. "Forest Service dispatch," the voice said. "We've got a missing hiker situation. Need a supply drop for the search team." "Where?" "Tug Hollow area. Past mile marker 42. My blood went cold. I thought that area was closed." "Closed?" "No, it's active. Got a ranger station up there, fully staffed." "Where'd you get the idea it was closed?" I grabbed the work order when it came through. Standard SAR support, medical supplies, extra batteries, emergency rations, to be delivered to Tug Hollow Watch Station for Ranger Thomas Mitchell. The work order was signed by Regional Supervisor Michael Patterson. I walked back to Patterson's office with the order in my hand. He was on the phone, but looked up when I knocked. "About that Tug Hollow delivery," I began. "What about it?" he asked, covering the phone. "Standard SAR support. Thomas requested it an hour ago." "But you just told me there was no Thomas, that the station was closed." Patterson looked at me with genuine concern. "I never said that. Are you feeling okay? You've been acting strange all day." I looked at the work order again. It was real, official, signed in Patterson's familiar scrawl. But I remembered our conversation from an hour ago, as clearly as if it were happening again. "Maybe you should go home," Patterson said gently. "Get some rest. I'll have Kevin handle the delivery." "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "I'll take it." Patterson hesitated. "Are you sure? If you're not feeling well?" "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." But I wasn't fine. And as I loaded supplies into my truck for the second time in 12 hours, I began to understand that whatever was happening at Tug Hollow wasn't confined to the forest. It was spreading. The drive up the mountain was exactly like the night before. Same fog, same wrong-feeling trees, same sense of being watched. But this time, I was prepared. Flare gun loaded, backup flashlights, emergency radio, and most importantly, I knew what I was walking into. Or thought I did. The station looked different in daylight. Cleaner, newer, like it had been recently maintained. Smoke rose from the chimney, and I could see a figure moving around inside. The bone ornaments were gone, the symbols carved into the walls had vanished, and the fence around the perimeter looked freshly repaired. I knocked on the door, and it opened to reveal a man in a ranger uniform. Tall, middle-aged, with graying hair and kind eyes. The name tag on his shirt read, T. Mitchell. "You must be the supply delivery," he said, smiling. "Thanks for coming up. The search team's going to need these supplies." He looked completely normal, completely human, but when he shook my hand, his skin was ice cold. "Thomas?" I asked. "That's right. Have we met?" I studied his face, looking for some sign of the thing I'd seen being devoured in the ravine. But this Thomas seemed real, solid, alive. "Where's the search team?" "Down in the forest," he replied, gesturing toward the trees. "Following a new trail. Strange thing. It just appeared overnight, perfectly straight, like someone carved it through the woods." He invited me inside for coffee, and the station looked exactly as it should. Clean, organized, functioning. Radio equipment humming quietly in the corner. Maps spread across the table. Normal ranger business. But on the wall, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, were symbols. Faint scratches in the wood that might have been random damage, but weren't. And hanging from a peg by the door was a necklace I recognized. Fingers strung on sinew, still fresh enough to wear wedding rings. Thomas followed my gaze and smiled. "Souvenirs from the search," he said casually. "We've been finding all sorts of interesting things." "What kind of things?" "Come with me," he said. "I'll show you." He led me outside and pointed toward the forest. "There's something you need to see. Something important." In the distance, barely visible through the trees, I could see the path, the same perfectly straight line I'd followed the night before. But now there were people on it. Tiny figures in the distance, walking single file toward something I couldn't see. "The search team?" I asked. "Among others," Thomas replied. "It's amazing how many people get lost in these woods, and how many of them find their way to us." He turned to look at me, and for just a moment, his face flickered. Like a TV with bad reception, I caught a glimpse of something else underneath. Something with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light. "You should join them," he said, in a voice that was only mostly human. "Everyone's welcome here. Everyone becomes part of the family." Behind him, the forest began to move, trees swaying without wind, shadows shifting without light source. And from somewhere deep in the woods came the sound of voices calling for help. Dozens of voices. All different, all desperate, all using words they'd learned from people who were no longer in a position to object. I backed away from Thomas, toward my truck. He didn't try to stop me, just smiled with that almost human face. "You'll be back," he said confidently. "They always come back. The forest calls to them." I got in my truck and drove away as fast as the mountain road would allow. But he was right. 3 weeks later, I found myself taking another route that happened to pass near mile marker 42. Just checking, I told myself. Just making sure. The turnoff to Tug Hollow was gone. Not closed, gone. There was no road, no sign, no indication that anything had ever been there. Just unbroken forest stretching away into the distance. I stopped at the ranger station to ask about it, but the clerk looked at me strangely. "Tug Hollow," she said. "Never heard of it. Are you sure you have the right area?" I checked the maps. Mile marker 42 was right where it should be, but there was nothing marked beyond it. No station, no access road, no indication that humans had ever penetrated that part of the forest. But sometimes, late at night, I get calls on my radio. Voices asking for help, claiming to be lost in the woods near Tug Hollow. They give detailed descriptions of their location, beg for rescue, promise to stay exactly where they are until help arrives. The voices are always different, but they're using the same words, the same phrases, like they're reading from a script. I don't respond to those calls anymore. And I don't take delivery jobs that require me to work alone. Because I know, with absolute certainty, that somewhere in those woods is a path that appears when the fog rolls in. A path that leads to a station that may or may not exist, staffed by people who may or may not be human. And they're still looking for new family members. They're very patient. They have all the time in the world. And they never forget a face. The Montana sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as I made my way through the dense forest, following the familiar path to the research facility. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was October 15th, 2025, and at 38 years old, I had been working as a geneticist for the U.S. government for over a decade. My name is David Myers, though few people here knew me by that name. In this place, secrecy was currency, and true identities were buried beneath layers of clearance and carefully crafted pseudonyms. As I approached the facility, its imposing structure came into view. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like nothing more than an abandoned warehouse, its exterior weathered and unremarkable. But I knew better. Beneath that unassuming facade lay a labyrinth of cutting-edge laboratories and containment units, all dedicated to pushing the boundaries of genetic engineering. I pressed my palm against the hidden biometric scanner, concealed within a knot in an old oak tree. A soft beep confirmed my identity, and a section of the forest floor silently slid away, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. As I made my way down, fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating the sterile white walls of the underground passage. The air grew cooler as I descended, the scent of pine replaced by the sharp tang of disinfectant. The low hum of machinery grew louder with each step, a constant reminder of the facility's ceaseless activity. At the bottom of the stairs, I faced another security checkpoint. This time, a retinal scan and a series of complex gestures were required to grant me access. As the final door hissed open, I stepped into the heart of the facility. The main atrium was a hive of activity, even at this early hour. Scientists in pristine white lab coats hurried from one section to another, their faces a mix of excitement and exhaustion. Holographic displays flickered in the air, showing complex genetic sequences and real-time data from various experiments. I made my way to my workstation in the genetics wing, nodding to a few colleagues as I passed. Most kept their heads down, focused intently on their work. In a place like this, friendly chatter was rare. We all knew the weight of our responsibilities, the secrecy our work demanded. As I settled into my chair and powered up my computer, Dr. Sharon Lewis, one of the few people I considered a friend in this isolated world, approached my desk. Her usually meticulously styled hair was disheveled, and dark circles under her eyes suggested she had been here all night. "David," she said, her voice low and urgent, "we need to talk about Subject 5. I felt a chill run down my spine at the mention of our most classified project. Subject 5 was the culmination of years of research, a creature born from the fusion of Komodo dragon and grizzly bear DNA. It was meant to be the ultimate adaptive organism, capable of surviving in the harshest conditions and regenerating from severe injuries. But lately, things had been different. "What's happened?" I asked, leaning in close to ensure our conversation remained private. Sharon glanced around nervously before continuing. "It's growing again, and not just physically. The cognitive tests we ran yesterday, David, it's off the charts. It's learning at a rate we've never seen before." I ran a hand through my hair, a habit I'd developed when stressed. "That's impossible. We designed its neural pathways to have limits. It shouldn't be capable of this level of growth." "Well, it is," Sharon replied, her voice tinged with a mix of fear and awe. "And that's not all. It's been watching us, not just observing, but studying. The way it tracks movement, the way it responds to stimuli. It's almost as if it's analyzing us." The implications of what Sharon was saying sent a wave of unease through me. We had created Subject 5 to be adaptable, yes, but always within our control. If it was truly developing beyond our parameters, we could be dealing with something far more dangerous than we had ever anticipated. "We need to inform Dr. Reiner," I said, referring to the project lead. "If Subject 5 is evolving this rapidly, we may need to consider termination protocols." Sharon nodded, her face grim. "He's called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. But David, I think we both know it might be too late for that." As Sharon walked away, I turned to my computer, pulling up the latest data on Subject 5. As I scrolled through the charts and graphs, each showing exponential growth and development, a sense of dread began to settle in my stomach. We had set out to create a new form of life, something that could revolutionize warfare and survival in extreme conditions. But as I stared at the cold, hard data before me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had created something we could no longer control. Little did I know, as I sat there poring over the data, that in just a few short hours, my worst fears would be realized. The creature we had brought into this world was about to break free, and the quiet, secluded facility I had called home for so long would become a battleground for survival. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to steady my nerves. There was work to be done, tests to run, and a creature to contain. But deep down a voice whispered that we were already too late. The calm I felt in that moment was nothing more than the deceptive quiet before a storm of unimaginable proportions. As I opened my eyes and began my day's work, I had no idea that by nightfall, everything I knew about Project Nemesis, about my colleagues, and about the very nature of life itself, would be forever changed. The hands of the clock ticked steadily onward, counting down to a moment that would alter the course of my life, and potentially the fate of the world, forever. The hours ticked by with an agonizing slowness as I immersed myself in the latest data from Subject 5. Each new piece of information only served to deepen my unease. The creature's cellular structure was evolving at a rate that defied all our previous models. Its neural pathways were reconfiguring themselves in patterns we had never seen before in any known species. As the afternoon approached, I made my way to the high-security wing where Subject 5 was housed. The creature's containment unit was a marvel of engineering. A reinforced chamber the size of a small warehouse, with walls of foot-thick transparent aluminum. As I approached, I could see the creature through the barrier, its massive form curled in one corner. Subject 5 had grown to the size of a small elephant, its body a grotesque fusion of reptilian scales and thick, bear-like fur. Its head swiveled towards me as I entered the observation area, and I felt a chill run down my spine as its eyes locked onto mine. Those eyes, they were different now. No longer the cold, reptilian stare of a predator, but something more. Something unsettlingly intelligent. "Fascinating, isn't it?" The voice startled me out of my reverie. Dr. Reiner had entered the room, His weathered face set in lines of concentration as he gazed at the creature. Fascinating isn't the word I'd use, I replied, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Sir, have you seen the latest cognitive test results? This thing is evolving, Dr. Reiner finished for me. Yes, I've seen the data. It's unprecedented, David. We're on the brink of something revolutionary here. I turned to face him, incredulous. Revolutionary? Dr. Reiner, with all due respect, we're losing control. This creature is developing faster than we can study it. We need to consider implementing the termination protocol before... Before what? Dr. Reiner's voice had taken on a sharp edge. Before we unlock the secrets of accelerated evolution? Before we create the perfect adaptive organism? Do you have any idea what this could mean for humanity, David? I felt my frustration rising. I know exactly what it could mean, sir. It could mean unleashing something we can't control. Something that could threaten not just this facility, but potentially the entire world. Dr. Reiner's eyes narrowed. You're letting fear cloud your judgment, David. We're scientists. We don't run from the unknown, we embrace it, we study it, we master it. Before I could respond, an alarm blared through the facility. Red lights began flashing and a computerized voice echoed through the corridors. Warning, containment breach in Sector 7. All personnel evacuate immediately. My blood ran cold. Sector 7 was where we kept our other test subjects, the precursors to Subject 5. If they were loose, Dr. Reiner was already moving, barking orders into his comm unit. I cast one last glance at Subject 5, only to find it staring directly at me, and in that moment I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something in its eyes. Understanding, anticipation. I sprinted out of the observation room, my heart pounding in my chest. The corridors were chaos, filled with panicked researchers and security personnel rushing in all directions. I fought against the tide, making my way towards Sector 7. As I rounded a corner, I collided with Sharon. Her lab coat was torn, and there was a wild look in her eyes. David, she gasped, clutching my arm. It's a disaster. The subjects in Sector 7, they're loose, and they're changing. Changing? What do you mean? I demanded. But deep down, I already knew the answer. They're evolving just like Subject 5, Sharon explained, her voice shaking. But faster, more aggressively. It's like they're adapting to their freedom. David, they're killing anyone they come across. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If the lesser subjects were capable of this, what would happen if Subject 5 broke free? We need to lock down the facility, I said, trying to think through the panic clouding my mind. Contain the outbreak and prevent Subject 5 from... My words were cut off by a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the facility. It was a sound I had heard before, but never with such power, such intent. Sharon's face went pale. That's not from Sector 7, she whispered. As if in confirmation, the facility's AI spoke again. Warning, containment breach in Subject 5 habitat. All personnel initiate emergency protocol Omega. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The enormity of what was happening crashed over me like a tidal wave. We had created something beyond our understanding, beyond our control, and now it was free. The sound of shattering glass and twisting metal echoed through the corridor, growing louder by the second. Sharon and I exchanged a look of pure terror. Run, I said, and we both took off down the hallway, the sounds of destruction nipping at our heels. As we ran, I couldn't shake the image of Subject 5's eyes from my mind. Those weren't the eyes of a mindless beast. They were the eyes of something that had been waiting, planning, evolving for this very moment. We had sought to play God, to create life and mold it to our will. But in our arrogance, we had failed to consider a crucial question. What if our creation decided it no longer needed its creators? The facility, once a bastion of scientific ambition, had become a labyrinth of terror. And somewhere in its twisted corridors, a creature of our own making was hunting us. The true test of survival was about to begin, and I had a sickening feeling that we were woefully unprepared for what was to come. The corridors of the facility had transformed into a nightmare landscape. Emergency lights bathed everything in a pulsating red glow, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to reach out with grasping fingers. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and something else, something primal and musky that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Sharon and I raced through the chaos, our lab coats flapping behind us like broken wings. The sounds of destruction grew louder, punctuated by screams that were abruptly cut short. My mind reeled, trying to process the situation while simultaneously plotting our escape. We need to get to the emergency bunker, I shouted to Sharon over the din of alarms and distant roars. "It's our best chance of survival until help arrives." She nodded grimly, her face a mask of determination and fear. We rounded a corner and came face to face with a scene of carnage that stopped us in our tracks. The corridor was strewn with bodies, or what was left of them. Blood painted the walls in abstract patterns, and the floor was littered with discarded limbs and viscera. Sharon retched, turning away from the gruesome sight. I fought the urge to do the same, forcing myself to scan the area for any sign of immediate danger. That's when I saw it, a trail of bloody footprints leading away from the massacre. They were massive, easily twice the size of a human foot, with clear imprints of claws that had torn into the metal flooring. "It's learning," I muttered, a chill running down my spine. "It's adapting to bipedal movement." Before Sharon could respond, a blood-curdling shriek echoed from somewhere behind us. It wasn't the roar of Subject 5, but something smaller, faster, one of the escaped test subjects from Sector 7. "Move," I yelled, grabbing Sharon's arm and pulling her into motion. We sprinted down the corridor, following the emergency exit signs that would lead us to the bunker. The shrieking grew louder, accompanied by the sound of claws scrabbling against metal. We burst through a set of double doors into a large laboratory. Equipment lay scattered and broken across the floor, and sparks flew from damaged electrical panels. I quickly scanned the room, looking for anything we could use as a weapon. The doors behind us exploded inward, and a creature lunged into the lab. It was one of our early experiments, a fusion of wolf and mountain lion DNA. But it had changed, grown larger and more fearsome. Its eyes gleamed with a feral intelligence as it stalked towards us, muscles rippling beneath its mottled fur. Sharon backed away, her hands fumbling for something on a nearby lab table. The creature tensed, preparing to pounce. Time seemed to slow as I watched its haunches coil, ready to spring. In that moment, Sharon's hand closed around a fire extinguisher. With a cry of desperation, she swung it in a wide arc, catching the leaping creature mid-air. There was a sickening crunch as the metal canister connected with its skull, sending it crashing into a bank of computers. "Run!" Sharon screamed, dropping the extinguisher and bolting for the far door. I didn't need to be told twice. We raced through the exit, the sounds of the creature's enraged howls spurring us on. The next few minutes were a blur of endless corridors and stairwells. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Finally, we reached the entrance to the emergency bunker, a massive steel door set into the bedrock of the mountain. I slammed my hand onto the biometric scanner, praying that the backup systems were still operational. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a hiss of hydraulics, the door began to slide open. We squeezed through as soon as the gap was wide enough, and I immediately hit the emergency lockdown button on the inside panel. The door slid shut with a resounding clang, sealing us inside. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the chaos we just escaped. Sharon and I stood there, chests heaving as we gulped in air. The bunker's soft blue emergency lighting was a stark contrast to the hellish red we'd left behind. "We made it," Sharon gasped, leaning against the wall for support. "Oh God, David, what have we done?" I didn't answer immediately, my mind still racing. We were safe for the moment, but for how long? And what about the others? How many had survived the initial outbreak? I moved to the bunker's main console, bringing up the facility's security feeds. Most of the cameras were offline, showing nothing but static, but a few were still operational, offering glimpses of the horror unfolding above us. One feed showed a group of researchers barricaded in a lab, desperately trying to hold the door shut as something massive pounded against it from the outside. Another revealed a corridor where two of the smaller test subjects were tearing into the body of a security guard. And then I saw it, Subject 5. The creature had grown even larger, its form a nightmarish blend of bear, lizard, and something altogether alien. It moved with a purpose, its head swiveling as it systematically checked each room it passed. It was hunting, searching. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. This wasn't just an escape. It wasn't just a rampage of mindless violence. Subject 5 was methodically sweeping the facility, and I had a sickening feeling I knew what, or who it was looking for. "Sharon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's looking for us, the ones who created it." Her eyes widened in horror as she joined me at the console, watching the creature's deliberate progress through the facility. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why us?" I shook my head, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. "I don't know. Revenge? Curiosity? Or maybe—" I trailed off, a new and terrifying thought forming in my mind. "Maybe what, David?" Sharon pressed, gripping my arm. I turned to face her, the full weight of our actions crashing down upon me. Maybe it wants to understand its creators, to learn from us, to surpass us. The implications hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. We had created a new form of life, one that was evolving at an unprecedented rate. And now, it seemed, that creation wanted to meet its makers. As if in response to my words, Subject 5 suddenly stopped its movement through the corridor. It turned its massive head, looking directly into the camera. Those eyes, intelligent, curious, and utterly alien, seemed to stare right through the lens and into my soul. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its throat, and I swore I could feel the vibrations even through the layers of rock and steel that separated us. The message was clear. It knew we were watching, and it was coming for us. The bunker's oppressive silence was broken only by the soft hum of equipment and our ragged breathing. Sharon paced nervously, her footsteps echoing off the metal walls, while I remained transfixed by the security feeds. Most screens now showed only static, but a few still flickered with scenes of destruction and chaos. "We need a plan," Sharon said, her voice tight with tension. "We can't just sit here and wait for that thing to find us." I tore my eyes away from the monitors, forcing myself to think rationally. "You're right. First things first, we need to assess our resources. This bunker was designed to sustain a small team for weeks if necessary. Let's see what we have to work with." We began a systematic search of the bunker, cataloging supplies and equipment. Emergency rations, water purifiers, medical kits, all the essentials for long-term survival. But what caught my attention was a secure locker in the back of the bunker. "Sharon, help me with this," I called out, examining the biometric lock. Together, we placed our palms on the scanner. After a tense moment, the lock disengaged with a soft click. Inside, we found a cache of weapons, high-powered tranquilizer rifles, stun batons, and even a few conventional firearms. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. This bunker wasn't just for riding out emergencies. It was a last line of defense. "David," Sharon's voice was barely above a whisper. "Look at this." She held up a tablet, its screen glowing with encrypted files. It's Dr. Riener's personal data cache. Everything about Project Nemesis, all the details we were never privy to. My hands shook slightly as I took the tablet from her. Let's see what secrets the good doctor was keeping from us. For the next hour, we pored over the files, each new revelation more shocking than the last. Project Nemesis wasn't just about creating adaptive organisms for military applications. It was about pushing the very boundaries of evolution itself. "My God," I muttered, scrolling through pages of genetic sequences and theoretical models. They weren't just splicing DNA. They were trying to unlock rapid, directed evolution, to create organisms that could adapt to any environment in real time. Sharon leaned in, her eyes widening as she read over my shoulder. "But that's impossible. The energy requirements alone would be astronomical," I finished for her. "Unless—" We looked at each other, the same horrifying realization dawning on us both. "Unless they found a way to draw energy from their environment," Sharon said, her voice barely above a whisper, "to fuel their evolution by consuming other life forms." The implications hit me like a physical blow. We hadn't just created a monster. We had created a perfect predator, one that evolved with every kill, becoming stronger, smarter, more adapted to its prey. A sudden bang from above made us both jump. Something was in the ventilation system, moving through the ducts with surprising speed. "It can't be Subject 5, Sharon said, her voice shaking. "It's too big for the vents." "No," I agreed, grabbing one of the tranquilizer rifles. But remember, it wasn't the only thing that escaped. We backed away from the ceiling, weapons raised. The banging grew louder, more frantic. Something was trying to get in. With a screech of tearing metal, a section of the vent cover burst open. A blur of fur and claws dropped into the room. One of the smaller test subjects, a hybrid of lynx and mongoose. But like the creature we had encountered earlier, this one had changed, evolved. Its body was leaner, more streamlined, with oversized eyes adapted for the dim light of the bunker. It crouched, muscles coiled to spring. In that split second before it attacked, I saw something in its eyes that chilled me to my core. Not just hunger or aggression, but a cold, calculating intelligence. I fired the tranquilizer rifle, the dart whistling through the air. But the creature was faster, dodging with inhuman speed. It launched itself at Sharon, claws extended. She screamed, bringing up her arm to protect her face. The creature's claws raked across her forearm, leaving deep gashes. But Sharon didn't falter. She swung the stun baton in her other hand, catching the hybrid mid-leap. There was a crack of electricity and a high-pitched shriek. The creature convulsed, then fell to the floor, twitching. I rushed to Sharon's side, examining her wound. "We need to treat this now," I said, already reaching for the medical kit. As I cleaned and bandaged her arm, Sharon stared at the fallen creature, her face pale. "David," she said softly, "look at its claws." I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. The creature's claws were changing, elongating and hardening before our eyes. It was adapting, evolving in response to our defenses. "We can't stay here," I said, finishing the bandage with shaking hands. "If this one found a way in—" A bone-shaking roar cut me off, so loud it seemed to make the very air vibrate. It was close, too close. Subject 5 had found us. "The emergency exit," Sharon gasped, clutching her injured arm. "There's a tunnel that leads to the surface." We grabbed what supplies we could, stuffing them into backpacks, along with weapons and the tablet containing Dr. Reiner's files. As we ran for the exit, I cast one last glance at the security feeds. Every screen was filled with the same image, Subject 5's massive form, its eyes staring directly into the camera. And behind it, barely visible in the shadows, were more shapes. Smaller, but just as deadly. The other test subjects, following their alpha. They had formed a pack. And we were the prey. As we entered the escape tunnel, the sound of tearing metal echoed behind us. The bunker door was giving way. Our desperate race for survival had only just begun. The escape tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare, barely wide enough for us to move single file. The air was stale and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Our footsteps echoed off the rough-hewn walls, each sound seeming to mock our attempts at stealth. I led the way, the beam of my flashlight casting long, twisted shadows ahead of us. Sharon followed close behind, her breathing ragged and punctuated by occasional whimpers of pain. I could only imagine how much her injured arm must be hurting, but we couldn't afford to stop. The roars and screeches from the creatures pursuing us grew fainter as we delved deeper into the tunnel. But I knew better than to feel relieved. If anything, the silence was more terrifying. Those things were hunters, and hunters knew the value of stealth. "David," Sharon gasped after what felt like hours of climbing. I need to rest, just for a moment." I wanted to push on, every instinct screaming at me to keep moving, but one look at Sharon's pale, sweat-streaked face told me she was at her limit. We needed to regroup, to plan our next move. "All right," I conceded, scanning our surroundings. "There's a small alcove up ahead. We can stop there, catch our breath." The alcove was little more than a natural indentation in the rock, but it offered some shelter and a chance to get our bearings. As Sharon slumped against the wall, I dug through our hastily packed supplies for the medical kit. "Let me see your arm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I unwrapped the makeshift bandage. The wound beneath made my stomach churn. The gashes left by the creature's claws were deep, the flesh around them an angry red. But what truly horrified me were the faint, web-like patterns spreading from the wound, dark lines branching out under Sharon's skin. "Oh God," Sharon whispered, seeing the look on my face. It's changing me, isn't it?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think clinically. "We don't know that for sure. It could just be an infection. I'm going to clean it again and give you a strong antibiotic. That should help." Even as I said the words, I knew they were likely a lie. Whatever was happening to Sharon was beyond the scope of normal medicine. The creature that had attacked her was designed to evolve, to adapt. Who knew what kind of pathogens or mutagens its claws might carry? As I rebandaged her arm, a low rumble echoed through the tunnel. It wasn't the roar of Subject 5, but something deeper, more primal. The very rock around us seemed to shudder. "What was that?" Sharon asked, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, the tremor came again, stronger this time. Small pebbles and dust rained down from the ceiling. "Earthquake?" Sharon suggested, but I shook my head. "No, this is something else. Remember, this facility was built into an old mining complex. These tunnels probably run for miles, connecting to all sorts of unstable caverns and—" My words were cut off as a deafening crack split the air. The floor beneath us shifted, and suddenly we were falling, tumbling into darkness as the tunnel collapsed around us. I reached out blindly, managing to grab Sharon's hand as we slid down a steep incline of loose rock and soil. We hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. The beam of my flashlight, miraculously still functioning, illuminated a swirling cloud of dust. "Sharon?" I called out, my voice hoarse. "Sharon, are you all right?" A groan to my left answered me. I crawled towards the sound, my hands finding Sharon's form in the darkness. "I'm okay," she managed, though her voice was strained. "Just bruised. Where are we?" As the dust began to settle, I swung my flashlight around, revealing our new surroundings. We had fallen into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness high above us. The walls glittered with mineral deposits, and in the distance, I could hear the sound of running water. But what caught my attention, what made my blood run cold, were the markings on the cavern walls. Crude paintings, ancient beyond imagining, depicted scenes that sent a shiver down my spine. Human figures, dwarfed by monstrous shapes, creatures that seemed to shift and change from one image to the next. And everywhere, a symbol that looked disturbingly like a double helix. "David," Sharon whispered, following the beam of my flashlight. "What is this place?" I shook my head, unable to find words. The implications were too vast, too terrifying to contemplate. Had our experiment somehow tapped into something ancient? Something that had been here long before us? A splash echoed from the darkness, followed by a low, guttural growl. We weren't alone in this cavern. "We need to move," I said, helping Sharon to her feet. "Now." As we stumbled forward, deeper into the unknown, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled upon something far bigger than Project Nemesis. Something that might hold the key to our survival, or spell doom not just for us, but for all of humanity. The hunt continued, but now I wasn't sure if we were the hunters or the hunted. And in the depths of the earth, surrounded by echoes of a forgotten past, the line between predator and prey seemed to blur with every step we took. We moved through the cavern with agonizing slowness, every step a potential betrayal in the uneven terrain. The beam of my flashlight seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast darkness that surrounded us, barely illuminating a few feet ahead. The air was thick with moisture, and the musty scent of age-old decay. Sharon leaned heavily on me, her injured arm cradled against her chest. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, even through our clothes. Whatever was happening to her, it was progressing rapidly. "David," she whispered, her voice weak. "I need to rest, just for a moment." I wanted to push on, but I knew she was at her limit. We found a small outcropping of rock that offered some shelter and settled down. As Sharon slumped against the cool stone, I took the opportunity to examine our surroundings more closely. The cavern walls were a testament to deep time, layers upon layers of sediment telling a story millions of years in the making. But it was the paintings that drew my attention once more. In the shifting light of the flashlight, they seemed almost alive, the crude figures dancing across the stone. "What do you think they mean?" Sharon asked, following my gaze. I shook my head, trying to make sense of the images. "I'm not sure, but look at this." I pointed to a recurring symbol, a spiraling shape that bore an uncanny resemblance to a DNA double helix. "This can't be a coincidence." Sharon's eyes widened. "You don't think... Could our research have somehow awakened something? Something that was already here?" Before I could respond, a low growl echoed through the cavern. We froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the scrape of claws on stone. "We need to move," I whispered, helping Sharon to her feet. We stumbled forward, deeper into the cavern. The sound of running water grew louder, and soon we found ourselves on the bank of an underground river. The water was black as ink, flowing swift and silent into the darkness. A screech tore through the air, so close it made my ears ring. I whirled around, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the cavern walls. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of scales and fur, eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Run!" I shouted, all pretense of stealth abandoned. We splashed into the river, the icy water shocking me to my core. The current was strong, threatening to sweep us off our feet, but it was our only chance. As we struggled against the flow, I heard a series of splashes behind us. Our pursuers had entered the water. I chanced to look back and immediately wished I hadn't. Multiple shapes were cutting through the water with terrifying speed, their forms a nightmarish blend of aquatic and terrestrial adaptations. "They're evolving," Sharon gasped, her voice filled with a mix of terror and scientific awe, adapting to the water in real time. I gritted my teeth, pushing forward with every ounce of strength I had left. Less admiring, more swimming. The river carried us deeper into the earth, through twisting tunnels and vast chambers. Several times we were nearly dashed against rocks or dragged under by swirling eddies. All the while the creatures pursued us, their inhuman shrieks echoing off the cavern walls. Just as I thought my strength would give out, the river widened into a large, calm pool. We dragged ourselves onto a rocky shore, coughing and gasping for air. But our reprieve was short-lived. A massive shape rose from the water behind us, water cascading off scales that shifted and changed color to match the surrounding rock. It was Subject 5, but it had changed once again. Its form was now a perfect blend of terrestrial predator and aquatic hunter. As it loomed over us, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was it. We had come so far, unraveled so many mysteries, only to meet our end in this forgotten underworld. But then, something unexpected happened. Subject 5 didn't attack. Instead, it cocked its massive head, studying us with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. And then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, a guttural, resonating tone that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my skull. But somehow, impossibly, I understood. Creators, it said, the word filled with a mix of curiosity, anger, and something that might have been respect. Why? Sharon and I exchanged a look of pure disbelief. Our creation, our monster, had achieved something we had never even considered possible. It had evolved a capacity for language. As I stared into those alien eyes, I realized that everything had changed. We were no longer simply running for our lives. We were on the brink of a communication that could change the very course of evolution itself. With trembling voice, I began to speak, hoping against hope that I could find the words to bridge the gap between creator and creation, between past and future, between human and whatever Subject 5 had become. The fate of our world, I realized, might hinge on this impossible conversation in the depths of the earth. The cavern fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the soft lapping of water against the shore and our ragged breathing. Subject 5 towered over us, its massive form blocking out what little ambient light filtered through the cavern. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see its scales shifting, adapting to the environment in real time. Why? It repeated, the word reverberating through my bones. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. How do you explain the hubris of scientific ambition to a creature born of that very hubris? We created you to understand, I began, my voice shaking. To push the boundaries of what was possible. We wanted to unlock the secrets of evolution, to create life that could adapt to any environment. Subject 5's eyes narrowed, a disturbingly human expression on its alien face. Understand? No. Control. Power. You sought mastery over life itself. Sharon spoke up, her voice weak but determined. You're right. We were arrogant. We thought we could control the forces of nature, bend them to our will. But we were wrong. The creature turned its gaze to her, nostrils flaring. It seemed to sense the changes happening within her body, the result of the earlier attack. You change, it said. Not a question but a statement. Evolve, like us. Sharon nodded, a mix of fear and fascination in her eyes. Yes, it seems your genetic material is highly transmissible, adaptive. Subject 5 made a sound that might have been a laugh, a rumbling that shook the very air around us. Not transmissible, assimilative, we absorb, adapt, evolve, all life, one life. The implications of its words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about creating an adaptable organism. Subject 5 and its kind were capable of assimilating the genetic material of other life forms, incorporating it into their own evolution. They weren't just predators, they were a force of nature unto themselves. But why hunt us? I asked, struggling to understand. If you can evolve, adapt to any environment, why seek out your creators? Subject 5's form shifted, its features becoming more defined, almost human. To understand, to know why we exist, to decide. Decide what? Sharon asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. The creature's next words chilled me to my core. Whether creators deserve to exist alongside creation. In that moment, I realized the true magnitude of what we had done. We hadn't just created a new life form, we had birthed a new stage of evolution, one that had the power to absorb and assimilate all other life on Earth. And now, that creation was judging us, determining whether humanity itself was worthy of continued existence. We've made mistakes, I said, desperately trying to find the right words. Terrible mistakes. But humanity is more than just its flaws. We create, we love, we strive to understand the universe around us. And destroy, Subject 5 countered. Pollute, extinguish other life. I couldn't argue with that. Humanity's track record with the environment and other species was far from stellar. But I couldn't let this be the end of our story. Yes, we've done great harm, I admitted. But we also have the capacity for great good, for change, for growth. I paused, a realization dawning on me. Just like you, We evolve too, not physically like you, but mentally, culturally. We learn from our mistakes. Subject 5 was silent for a long moment, its form continuing to shift and change as it processed my words. Finally, it spoke again. Show us, it said. Prove that humanity can evolve, can coexist, or we will absorb, assimilate, become the new dominant life. With those words, Subject 5 retreated into the water, disappearing beneath the dark surface. The other creatures followed, leaving Sharon and me alone on the shore, shaken and overwhelmed by what had just transpired. As the adrenaline of the moment faded, the reality of our situation came crashing back. We were still deep underground, lost in a maze of caverns. Sharon's condition was deteriorating, and we had no idea how to get back to the surface. But we had been given a chance, a reprieve however temporary, and with it a monumental task, to prove that humanity was worthy of existence alongside this new form of life we had created. As I helped Sharon to her feet, I knew that our journey was far from over. We had to find a way out of these caverns, back to civilization. And when we did, we would face an even greater challenge. How do you convince the world to change its ways when the alternative is extinction? The fate of our species now rested on our ability to evolve, not physically, like Subject 5 and its kind, but morally, ethically, culturally. It was a daunting task, but as I looked at Sharon, seeing the determination in her eyes despite her condition, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had started this journey as scientists, seeking to unlock the secrets of evolution. Now, we would need to become something more, ambassadors for humanity itself, fighting for our very right to exist in a world we had irrevocably changed. With a deep breath, I turned my flashlight towards the darkness ahead. Come on, I said to Sharon. We have a long way to go. Together we took our first steps into an uncertain future, the weight of our species' fate heavy on our shoulders. Our journey through the caverns was a blur of darkness, pain, and desperate hope. Sharon's condition worsened with each passing hour, the alien DNA coursing through her veins, transforming her in ways I couldn't begin to understand. Yet she pressed on, her determination a beacon in the oppressive gloom. We followed the sound of rushing water, hoping it would lead us to the surface. The path was treacherous, filled with steep climbs and narrow ledges that tested our dwindling strength. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, shadowed by creatures born from our own ambition. After what felt like an eternity, we saw it, a faint glimmer of natural light. The cave mouth was high above us, a small opening in the cavern ceiling that promised freedom, but the wall was nearly vertical, a daunting climb even for someone in peak condition. We can't give up now, Sharon wheezed, her eyes fever bright. We have to warn them, David. We have to try to make things right. I nodded, steeling myself for the climb. Together then, one step at a time. The ascent was grueling. Our muscles screamed in protest, our fingers bloodied from gripping the sharp rock. Several times we nearly fell, saved only by desperate grabs at protruding stones. But inch by agonizing inch, we climbed. As we neared the top, I heard a familiar growl from below. Subject 5 and its pack had found us. They watched our climb but made no move to stop us. I realized with a chill that this was another test. They were assessing our will to survive, our determination to fulfill the task they had set before us. With a final Herculean effort, we hauled ourselves out of the cave and into the blinding sunlight. We lay there on the forest floor, gasping and trembling, overwhelmed by the fresh air and the warmth of the sun on our skin. But our ordeal was far from over. We were miles from civilization, without food or water, and Sharon's condition was critical. As I helped her to her feet, I saw movement in the cave entrance below. Subject 5 emerged, its form adapting seamlessly to the surface environment. It fixed us with that unnervingly intelligent gaze one last time, a clear message in its eyes. We'll be watching. Then it was gone, vanishing into the forest with unnatural speed. The trek back to civilization was a nightmare of exhaustion and paranoia. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent spikes of fear through me. When we finally stumbled onto a rural road and flagged down a passing truck, I almost couldn't believe we'd made it. The world we returned to was unchanged, blissfully unaware of the evolutionary time bomb ticking beneath the surface. Sharon was rushed to a hospital, where baffled doctors struggled to understand the changes racking her body. I was debriefed by stern-faced government officials who seemed more concerned with containment than comprehension. In the months that followed, I fought an uphill battle. I tried to convince world leaders of the threat we faced, the challenge laid before us by our own creation. Some dismissed me as a madman. Others saw only the military potential of what we had created, blind to the greater implications. Sharon's transformation stabilized, leaving her forever changed but alive. Her unique condition became proof of my claims, and slowly, too slowly, people began to listen. We formed a coalition of scientists, ethicists, and forward-thinking leaders. Our goal was monumental: to reshape human society, to prove that we could evolve beyond our destructive tendencies and coexist with the new form of life we had unleashed. It was a race against time. Every day brought reports of strange sightings, of animals behaving in impossible ways. Subject 5 and its kind were out there, watching, waiting, judging our progress. As I stand here now, years later, addressing the United Nations on the progress of our global initiative, I can't help but reflect on the journey that brought us here, the horrors we faced in those caverns, the impossible choice laid before us by our own creation. We have made strides. Renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, habitat restoration, humanity has shown a capacity for change that gives me hope. But we have so far yet to go, and the watchful eyes of our evolutionary successors are ever present. The world now knows the truth, and every person on this planet understands the stakes. Our future is not guaranteed. We must earn our place in this new world, proving with every action that humanity deserves to exist alongside the new paradigm of life we have unleashed. As I conclude my speech, I catch a glimpse of movement outside the window. For a moment I see a form that doesn't quite fit, eyes that hold an intelligence beyond anything natural. Subject 5, or one of its kind, watching, always watching. Our greatest creation has become our judge, jury, and potential executioner. Every day is a test, every action a statement of our worth as a species. The world has changed irrevocably, and we must change with it. This is humanity's greatest challenge, our final exam, and failure is not an option. The Wanajska Wilderness wasn't on any tourist maps. That's exactly why I took the ranger position when it opened up. After 8 years working overcrowded national parks, listening to visitors complain about spotty cell service while standing before nature's grandeur, I craved isolation. Wanajska offered that in abundance: 200,000 acres of untouched forest, craggy mountains, and mist-covered valleys in the Pacific Northwest. The name came from an obscure indigenous dialect, meaning land of shadows. I'd soon learn how fitting that name truly was. My cabin sat on the edge of Lake Ahot, a perfect mirror on windless days, reflecting the ancient pines that surrounded it like silent sentinels. The nearest town, Millerton, was a 2-hour drive down a winding gravel road that became impassable during heavy rains. My supervisors at the Forest Service made it clear during my interview: "You'll be alone out there most of the time. Self-sufficiency isn't just recommended, it's required." That suited me fine. My duties were straightforward: monitor trail conditions, assist the occasional lost hiker, track wildlife populations, and manage the small visitor center that rarely saw visitors. The cabin itself was rustic but functional: solar panels for minimal electricity, a wood stove for heat, a shortwave radio for emergencies, and a small motorboat to patrol the lake. Ranger Josephine Blackwell was my only regular human contact. At 57, she'd been working these woods longer than I'd been alive. She operated the northern station, about 18 miles up the ridge. We'd check in via radio every morning and evening, a protocol neither of us particularly enjoyed but followed religiously. "Morning check, Wanajska south to north, over," I called into the crackling radio on my third day. "North here. All quiet. Watch the western trails today. Storm came through and likely downed some trees, over." Joe's voice was always calm, matter of fact. "Copy that. I'll clear what I can. Out." I packed my gear: axe, small chainsaw, first aid kit, water, rations, map, compass, and the .45 sidearm all rangers carried, officially for protection against aggressive wildlife. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth as I headed out. The western trail started just behind my cabin, winding up through increasingly dense forest. 2 hours in, I found the first downed tree, a massive old pine blocking the path. As I fired up the chainsaw, something stopped me. A peculiar silence had fallen over the forest. No birds, no insects, nothing but the whisper of wind through needles. The hair on my arms stood up despite the warming day. That's when I noticed the footprints. They crossed the trail about 20 yards beyond the fallen tree. At first glance, they resembled bear tracks, but something was off. They were too elongated, the toe impressions too distinct, and they were huge, easily 16 inches long. I'd studied every predator species in these woods, and nothing matched what I was seeing. I approached cautiously, camera in hand instead of the chainsaw now. The impressions were deep, suggesting whatever made them was heavy. Following the tracks with my eyes, I saw they continued up the mountain. disappearing into a thicket of dense underbrush. A branch snapped somewhere in that direction. Then another, closer. Something large was moving toward me. Training kicked in. I backed away slowly, hand moving to my sidearm. The movement stopped. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows between trees. My breathing quickened as I continued retreating, never turning my back to the presence I could sense but not see. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. "Forest Service, identify yourself." No response came except for what sounded like deep, rhythmic breathing. I caught a whiff of something musky and wild, not the usual forest smells, but something alive and primal, something watching me. I took another step back, and my boot connected with a loose stone. As I stumbled slightly, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the thicket, not quite bear, not quite human. My blood seemed to congeal in my veins. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse through the foliage, a massive silhouette, standing upright where no bear would stand. In the dappled forest light, I made out what appeared to be a broad, sloped shoulder covered in dark fur, before it moved with surprising grace behind a massive pine trunk. I didn't wait to see more. Logic and professional composure abandoned me as I turned and ran back down the trail. Only when the cabin came into view did I slow, lungs burning, sweat soaking my uniform despite the cool air. That evening, I lied during radio check. All clear in the western section, removed 2 downed trees, no unusual activity to report. I couldn't bring myself to tell Josephine what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. Rangers who reported mythical creatures didn't last long in the service. Besides, there had to be a rational explanation, perhaps a diseased bear walking oddly, maybe light and shadow playing tricks. But as darkness fell over Lake Ahoti, I loaded my sidearm and kept it within reach. Outside my window, the ancient forest seemed to press closer, the darkness between the trees deeper than before. And somewhere out there, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd encountered was still watching, waiting, assessing. I fell into an uneasy sleep that night, dreaming of massive footprints leading to my door, and heavy breathing just outside my window. A week passed without incident. I'd almost convinced myself that stress and isolation had caused me to overreact to a perfectly normal forest encounter. Almost. The spring hiking season had begun, bringing the occasional backpacker through my station. Most were experienced outdoorsmen who needed little more than a trail update and a permit stamp. But the couple who arrived at midday were different. City folks with brand new gear and matching North Face jackets that still had the tags attached. "We're looking for the trail to Eagles Point," the man said, studying his smartphone GPS that wouldn't work once they were 2 miles in. His name was Gregory Hudson, a software engineer from Seattle. His girlfriend, Brooke Winters, kept glancing nervously at the tree line as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. "Eagles Point is a strenuous 8-mile hike," I explained, spreading the map on the counter. "The trail gets difficult after the first ridge. Given your experience level and the time of day, I'd recommend Lakeshore Trail instead. You can still make camp before dark." Gregory seemed disappointed but agreed. As I issued their backcountry permit, Brooke finally spoke. "Have there been any unusual wildlife sightings recently?" Her voice was quiet, hesitant. I looked up sharply. "What do you mean by unusual?" She exchanged a glance with Gregory before continuing. "We have a friend who hiked here last month. He came back different. Kept talking about seeing something in these woods that followed him for days." My pulse quickened, but I maintained my professional demeanor. "We have black bears, mountain lions, and occasionally wolves. All keep their distance if you follow proper precautions." I stamped their permit with more force than necessary. "Make noise while hiking, store food properly, stay on marked trails." They left looking unconvinced, and I couldn't blame them. I hadn't even convinced myself. That evening the weather changed abruptly. A heavy fog rolled in from the mountains, blanketing the lake in an impenetrable white shroud. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. During evening radio check, Josephine warned me it would likely last through the night. "Keep your ears open," she added cryptically before signing off. Around 2 a.m., the sound of my emergency radio jolted me awake. Through bursts of static, I heard Brooke's panicked voice. "Help! Something outside our tent. Not an animal, please." The transmission cut off. I tried to respond but received only static. Protocol dictated waiting until dawn for search and rescue operations in dangerous conditions, but I couldn't sit idle knowing they were in trouble. I dressed quickly, gathering essential gear. High-powered flashlight, first aid kit, emergency blankets, GPS unit, radio, and my sidearm. The fog had thickened, transforming familiar surroundings into an alien landscape. My flashlight beam penetrated only a few yards before dissolving into the mist. Lakeshore Trail should have been easy to follow even in these conditions, but nothing felt right. Familiar markers seemed moved or missing. The usual night sounds, owls, distant coyotes, rustling small animals, were conspicuously absent. Only the sound of water lapping at the shore and my own breathing accompanied me. An hour into the search, I found their campsite, or what remained of it. The tent lay in shreds, its contents scattered across a wide radius. No blood, thankfully, but no sign of Gregory or Brooke either. Their backpacks remained, food untouched in the bare canister they'd properly hung from a tree branch. "Gregory, Brooke," I called, my voice sounding muffled in the fog. Something crunched underfoot. Gregory's smartphone, screen shattered but still glowing weakly. I picked it up, noticing it was recording audio. Against better judgment, I pressed play. At first, just normal campsite sounds, whispered conversation, the rustle of sleeping bags. Then, silence broken by a twig snapping nearby. Gregory's voice. What was that? Brooke shushing him. More silence, stretching for nearly a minute. Then breathing. Deep, heavy breathing that wasn't coming from inside the tent. Something moving around their campsite. Brooke whispering. "It's standing right outside." Gregory's voice, barely audible. "Don't move." A long, low vocalization followed. Not quite a growl, not quite speech. Raising the hair on my neck. The recording ended with the sound of the tent zipper opening and Brooke's scream. I stood frozen, listening to the silence that followed the recording. Then, from somewhere in the fog behind me came the same vocalization I'd just heard on the phone. A deep rumbling call that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. I spun around, flashlight beam slicing through fog. For a moment I caught sight of something massive moving between trees. A flash of dark fur, the suggestion of a broad back disappearing into white mist. Without thinking, I pursued. "Forest Service, stop right there." I knew even as I shouted how absurd it was. Whatever I was following wasn't human and wouldn't heed my commands. The fog seemed to part momentarily, and I glimpsed Gregory stumbling through the underbrush ahead, alone and disoriented. I called out to him, but he either didn't hear or was too terrified to stop. He veered off the trail into dense forest, and I followed, pushing through branches that clawed at my face and clothes. The ground began to slope upward sharply. This wasn't right. Lakeshore Trail should have remained level. Somehow we'd ended up on a different path entirely, heading toward the mountains. Gregory remained just out of reach, a fleeting shadow in the mist. Suddenly the trees opened into a small clearing and Gregory was gone. In his place stood a figure that defied logical description. In the direct beam of my flashlight, I could no longer deny what I was seeing. A massive, fur-covered form, standing upright on two legs. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung below its knees. The face remained in shadow, but I could feel its gaze fixed directly on me. For what felt like minutes but could only have been seconds, we stood facing each other across the clearing. My hand hovered near my sidearm, but some instinct told me it would be useless. Then, deliberately, the creature raised one massive hand and pointed deeper into the forest before turning and disappearing with surprising silence into the fog. Trembling, I moved cautiously in the direction it had indicated. About 50 yards further, I found both Gregory and Brooke, huddled together at the base of a massive tree, shivering but unharmed. "It brought us here," Brooke whispered, eyes wide with shock. "It could have, but it just led us here and left us." "What was it?" Gregory asked, his former confidence shattered. I had no answer that wouldn't sound insane. "Let's get you both back to the station. We can sort this out there." As we made our way back, following my GPS rather than trail markers, none of us spoke about the creature, but all of us remained alertly scanning the fog around us, jumping at every sound. Just before we reached the lakeside trail, I found fresh tracks crossing our path, the same enormous footprints I'd seen a week earlier. Only this time, they weren't alone. Alongside the massive prints were 2 sets of human footprints, Gregory's and Brooke's, walking parallel, not running, not dragged, as if they'd been escorted. Back at the station, I gave them dry clothes and hot coffee. When they'd calmed sufficiently, I asked them to describe exactly what happened. "It was watching us all day," Brooke said quietly. "We felt it. When we made camp, it came closer." Gregory nodded. "When it tore open the tent, we ran in different directions. I got completely turned around in the fog. Then, it found me. It could have." He swallowed hard. "Instead, it herded me, like a sheepdog with a stray lamb, until we found Brooke again. Then it brought us both to that tree and just watched us from a distance until you came. I filed an official report. Hikers disoriented in fog. Tent damaged by unknown animal. Subjects recovered safely. Nothing about giant footprints or 8-foot fur-covered figures. Nothing that would raise questions or bring unwanted attention to Wanajiska. After Gregory and Brooke left the next morning, I sat alone in my cabin, staring at the plaster cast I'd made of one of the footprints. Whatever roamed these woods had encountered humans before. It knew our habits, our equipment. It had deliberately led 2 lost hikers to safety and guided me to them. This wasn't some mindless creature. And somehow, that made the forests of Wanajiska feel even more dangerous. The incident with Gregory and Brooke changed something fundamental about my relationship with Wanajiska. I'd come seeking isolation but now felt constantly observed. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made me tense. I began carrying my sidearm even for routine tasks around the cabin. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of being watched through my windows by eyes just above the roofline. 2 weeks after the fog incident, Josephine made a rare visit to my station. She arrived unannounced in her Green Forest Service truck, expression unreadable beneath her wide-brimmed hat. "Thought I'd check your equipment inventory in person," she said by way of greeting, though we both knew it was an excuse. Monthly inventories were done via radio check. Inside my cabin, she accepted a cup of coffee and got straight to the point. "Your report about the Hudson Winters incident was incomplete." My hand froze halfway to my mouth. "I documented everything relevant." Josephine fixed me with a steady gaze. "Did you now? Nothing unusual about how you found them?" "They got lost in the fog. It happens." She nodded slowly, then reached into her pack and produced a small leather journal, weathered by years of use. "I've been in these woods for 36 years. Started keeping this in my 2nd season." She opened it, revealing pages of handwritten notes, sketches, and what looked like pressed plant specimens. She flipped through until she found what she wanted, then turned it toward me. On the page was a detailed sketch of a footprint identical to the one I'd found. "First saw these in '97, she said matter-of-factly. "Then again in 2002, 2008, 2013, and now, apparently 2025. Always in spring, always following unusual weather." I stared at the drawing, my professional skepticism battling with the evidence of my own eyes. "What do you think it is?" "Locals have stories going back generations. The Chinook called it Saslik, the wild one. Loggers had different names. Me, I just call it the Warden." "The Warden?" She took a sip of coffee. "Been watching me for decades. Never threatened me once. But it has rules." "Rules?" I echoed, feeling like a parrot. "Stay on established trails. Don't cut healthy trees. Don't hunt in certain areas. Cross those lines, and it lets you know." She closed the journal. 3 missing hikers in my time here. All found exactly the same way. Disoriented but unharmed, claiming something herded them to safety after they'd become lost. I told her everything then. The footprints, the encounter on the Western Trail, what I'd witnessed in the fog. She listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as if I was confirming long-held suspicions. "Why keep this quiet?" I finally asked. "Why not report it properly?" Josephine's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "You know exactly why. Either we'd be dismissed as crazy, or worse, they'd believe us." "Worse if they believed us." "Think about it. If official confirmation of Sasquatch got out, what happens to Wanajiska? Research teams, media, tourists with cameras, hunters with rifles. This place would be trampled to death within a year." She leaned forward. "Whatever it is, it was here long before us and will be here long after. This is its territory. We're just visiting." After she left, I pulled out topographical maps of the wilderness area and began marking locations. Where I'd first seen the tracks, where Gregory and Brooke had encountered it, spots where I'd felt watched. A pattern emerged. All incidents occurred near boundaries, where maintained trails ended, where the old-growth forest began, where human presence gave way to true wilderness. Territorial markers. The Warden was patrolling its borders. That night, I made a decision. If I was going to continue working in Wanajiska, I needed to understand the rules of engagement. I packed for an overnight trek, leaving my sidearm behind, a gesture of trust, however foolish. I chose a trail Josephine had specifically mentioned in her journal, Sentinel Ridge, which local legends marked as a boundary not to be crossed. The day was clear, unusually warm for early spring. As I hiked, I deliberately left clear signs of my passage, breaking the first rule of wilderness travel. I wanted to be found. The ridge trail climbed steadily through changing forest ecosystems, from the mixed pine and fir of the lower elevations to ancient, gnarled alpines that had weathered centuries of mountain storms. By late afternoon, I reached the actual ridge, a knife edge of stone offering spectacular views across the wilderness. To the east lay the maintained areas of the park. To the west, untouched valleys rarely seen by human eyes. I made camp precisely on the boundary, pitching my tent on the ridge itself. As dusk fell, I lit a small fire, another calculated risk, as fires were technically prohibited above certain elevations. The flames cast dancing shadows against surrounding trees as darkness enveloped the mountain. Around midnight, the feeling of being watched intensified. The forest had gone silent again, that unnatural hush I was beginning to recognize as a warning sign. I remained seated by my fire, outwardly calm despite my racing heart. "I know you're there," I said aloud, my voice sounding thin in the vast darkness. "I'm not crossing your boundary. I just want to understand." No response came, but the sensation of observation didn't abate. I continued speaking, feeling slightly ridiculous but pressing on. "I'm here to protect this place too. From fires, from people who don't respect it. We want the same thing." A rock clattered down the slope behind me. I didn't turn, using every ounce of self-control to remain facing the fire. "The locals call you the warden. Is that what you are? A guardian?" The sound of heavy breathing came from the darkness beyond my firelight, that same deep rhythmic pattern I'd heard before. It circled my camp, always just out of sight. I fought the instinct to reach for a weapon that wasn't there. Hours passed this way, me talking occasionally, the present circling, neither of us crossing the invisible line between observation and contact. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I dozed beside the dying fire. I woke at dawn to find my campsite transformed. The fire had been expertly extinguished, covered with rocks in the proper wilderness manner. My scattered gear had been neatly arranged beside my tent, and encircling my entire camp was a ring of broken branches stuck into the ground, a clear boundary. Most disturbing of all, a crude arrow had been formed from stones pointing east, back toward my cabin, away from the wilderness beyond the ridge. The message couldn't have been clearer. Go back. Stay away. This is the line. I packed quickly, taking care to leave no trace beyond the strange marker circle, which I photographed from every angle before departing. As I descended the trail, that feeling of being watched gradually diminished. By the time I reached the forest below, I was alone again, or as alone as anyone ever was in Wanajiska. Back at my cabin, I added the ridge to my map of boundary encounters. A picture was forming, not just of territory but of purpose. The warden wasn't merely defending a physical space, it was maintaining a separation between worlds, the human and the wild, the known and the unknown. And I was standing directly on that increasingly fragile boundary. Summer arrived in Wanajiska with an unprecedented heat wave. Temperatures soared into the high 90s for weeks, turning the normally lush forest dangerously dry. Fire risk reached critical levels. The Forest Service implemented Stage 3 restrictions, no backcountry camping, no fires of any kind, and several trail closures. Despite the restrictions, visitor numbers increased. Urban dwellers sought escape from sweltering cities, ignoring warnings and regulations in their desperation for cool mountain air. My days became an endless cycle of issuing citations, breaking up illegal campsites, and patrolling for fire hazards. Throughout it all, the warden remained unseen but never unfelt. Several times, I'd arrive at reported illegal campsites to find them already abandoned, equipment hastily packed, occupants gone. Rangers from other districts joked about Wanajiska's spooky reputation that kept visitors in line. If only they knew. In late July, lightning strikes ignited 3 separate wildfires in the northern section of the wilderness. 2 were quickly contained, but the third, in a remote valley near Josephine's territory, proved stubborn. Soon, the entire northern district was filled with smoke and fire crews. During our evening radio check, Josephine's voice carried unusual tension. "They're cutting fire lines into the old growth on Ruby Creek. Heavy equipment." She didn't need to explain further. Ruby Creek lay in a valley that all her journal notes marked as strictly forbidden territory. "The incident commander knows what he's doing," I said, though uncertainty crept into my voice. "They need to contain it before it reaches the eastern ridges." "Perhaps." Her radio went silent for a moment. "Be vigilant tonight." The warning proved prophetic. Shortly after midnight, my emergency radio crackled to life. A bulldozer operator working the fire line had gone missing. He'd stepped away from his machine to check something in the forest and hadn't returned. Search crews were being assembled. I drove north immediately, the winding road illuminated by the eerie orange glow of the distant fire. Smoke hung thick in the air, carrying the acrid smell of burning pine. By the time I reached the command post, organized chaos reigned. Fire crews worked tirelessly on the main blaze while search teams prepared to enter the forest. The incident commander, a veteran firefighter named Rivera, briefed me quickly. Operator's name is Mike Sullivan, 42, experienced. Radio check missed at 23, a machine found idling at the edge of the cut line here. He pointed to a map. Search diameter expanding now. I studied the map, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The bulldozer had been cutting directly through an area marked in Josephine's journal with a simple warning, no entry. I know these woods better than anyone except Ranger Blackwell, I said. Let me take the northeastern quadrant alone. Rivera hesitated. Protocol says minimum 2-person teams. With all due respect, we're short-handed, and I can cover more ground solo. I have extensive search and rescue certification. This was stretching the truth, but he didn't need to know that. He relented, and I set out, headlamp illuminating the smoke-filled forest. Once out of sight from the command post, I switched off my lamp and paused, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. If Sullivan had encountered what I suspected, conventional search methods wouldn't help. I moved quietly, following game trails rather than crashing through underbrush. The smoke provided strange acoustic properties, muffling some sounds while amplifying others. Through the haze, I caught glimpses of the fire's glow, a malevolent sunset in the wrong direction. An hour into my search, I found the first sign, a hard hat lying on the ground, well beyond where Sullivan should have ventured alone. Nearby, the underbrush showed signs of someone moving quickly, not along any path but crashing desperately through the forest. I reported the find via radio, then continued following the trail of disturbed vegetation. It led steadily uphill, away from the fire, and deeper into forbidden territory. Occasionally I found more evidence, a torn piece of high-visibility vest, a dropped flashlight, a water bottle. The path of flight ended abruptly at a rock face rising 20 feet high, a natural barrier forming another territorial boundary. Sullivan's boot prints showed where he'd frantically tried to climb the slick stone before giving up. That's when I noticed the other prints surrounding his, the now familiar massive footprints of the warden, but not just one set. At least 3 distinct sizes and patterns circled Sullivan's position. I felt a chill despite the summer heat. There were more of them. A faint sound caught my attention, not from above as I expected, but from below, inside the rock face itself. I moved closer, discovering a narrow crevice partly hidden by brush. The sound came again, a human moan. "Sullivan?" I called softly. "Mike Sullivan? Forest Service. Are you hurt?" Another moan, followed by a weak voice. "Help, in here." I squeezed through the crevice, finding myself in a narrow passageway that opened into a small natural cave. My headlamp revealed Sullivan, lying on the stone floor, pale and shocked but largely uninjured aside from some scratches and bruises. "Thank God," he whispered when he saw me. "How did you find me?" They said no one would. I knelt beside him, checking his vitals. "Who said that, Mike?" His eyes widened. "You wouldn't believe me. I barely believe it myself." "Try me." He described how he'd spotted unusual movement at the forest edge while operating his bulldozer. Thinking it might be wildlife endangered by the fire, he'd gone to investigate. What he found instead were 3 massive, fur-covered figures watching his machine cut through ancient trees. "They were so fast," he said, voice trembling. "Before I could run, they had me. Could have torn me apart easily, but they just carried me, brought me here." "Did they harm you?" He shook his head, scared the hell out of me, but no. The big one brought water, left it there. He pointed to a crude bark container. "Been here hours, thought I'd die in here." Getting Sullivan out required careful navigation of the narrow passage. Once outside, I radioed our position and status. While waiting for the extraction team, I examined our surroundings more carefully. The cave entrance was well concealed, visible only from certain angles. A perfect observation post, or hiding place. "They're not animals," Sullivan said suddenly, breaking the silence. The way they looked at me, there was intelligence there, and anger. I nodded. "We crossed a line, cut down trees that have stood for centuries. For a fire break," he protested weakly, "to protect the rest of the forest." "I know, but I don't think they see it that way." The extraction team arrived 30 minutes later, bringing a backboard for Sullivan, although he insisted he could walk. As they prepared him for transport, I noticed fresh prints in the soft earth nearby. The warden and its companions had been watching us the entire time. On our walk back to the command post, the search team leader pulled me aside. How'd you find him so quickly? That cave wasn't on any of our maps. I shrugged. Just got lucky, I guess. But luck had nothing to do with it. The warden had wanted Sullivan found. Had practically led me to him. A warning, not a threat. A message delivered and received. Back at the fire command center, I sought out Rivera. You need to redirect the bulldozers. Cut your line further east, away from Ruby Creek Valley. He frowned. That adds miles to the line and puts us dangerously close to the access road. Trust me, I insisted. That valley is unstable, dangerous terrain. Sullivan was lucky. Next person might not be. Whether it was something in my expression or simply respect for local knowledge, Rivera reconsidered. By morning, the heavy equipment had been repositioned according to my recommendation. The fire was contained 3 days later without further incidents. As crews began cleanup operations, I visited the original fire line where it abruptly ended at the edge of Ruby Creek Valley. The massive machines had left an ugly scar across the landscape, toppled trees lying like fallen soldiers. Beyond the line, the ancient forest stood undisturbed, and at the precise boundary between destruction and preservation lay a perfect row of massive footprints, a line drawn in the earth itself. Message received indeed. As summer faded into autumn, an uneasy truce settled over Wanajiska. The fire's scars remained visible on the northern slopes, but new growth had already begun, nature's resilience on display. Tourism decreased with the cooling temperatures, allowing the wilderness to exhale after the pressure of human presence. I continued my duties with a heightened awareness of boundaries. My maps now contained detailed markings of territories, observations, and encounters. I'd begun my own journal, inspired by Josephine's decades of documentation. In its pages, I recorded not just factual observations, but theories, impressions, and the gradual evolution of my understanding. On a crisp October morning, I received an unexpected radio call from headquarters. The regional supervisor would be visiting all ranger stations for end-of-season assessments. My evaluation was scheduled for the following day. Regional Supervisor Maxwell Hayes was a career bureaucrat with little field experience but significant political ambition. His arrival at my cabin in a spotless SUV, wearing an immaculately pressed uniform more suited to a press conference than a remote wilderness station, set my teeth on edge immediately. "Ranger," he greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been reviewing your incident reports from this season. Fascinating reading." I maintained a neutral expression. "It was an eventful summer, sir." "Indeed." He glanced around my cabin, gaze lingering on the maps with their cryptic markings. Fire crew deployment, lost hikers, missing equipment, and yet consistently positive outcomes. Some might call it lucky. "Just doing my job, sir." Hayes picked up a plaster cast of a footprint I'd carelessly left visible on my desk. "And what exactly is this part of your job?" My mouth went dry. "Wildlife tracking. Standard monitoring procedure." "Really?" "Because it looks remarkably like what some would call Bigfoot evidence." His tone became condescending. "I hadn't pegged you for one of those, Ranger." "Sir?" He set down the cast with visible distaste. "We've had reports, hikers claiming they were herded by creatures. A bulldozer operator telling wild stories after getting himself lost. All in your district. People experience strange things in the wilderness," I said carefully. "Stress, isolation, fear, they can affect perception." "Precisely my point." Hayes smiled again, this time with satisfaction, "which is why I'm implementing new protocols for Wanagiska. Increased accessibility, additional marked trails, a proper visitor center near Ruby Creek. We've secured federal funding to enhance the wilderness experience." Each word hit like a physical blow. Ruby Creek, the very heart of the warden's territory, transformed into a tourist attraction. "With respect, sir, developing Ruby Creek would be a mistake. The ecosystem there is fragile, the terrain unstable. Your concerns are noted, Ranger, but the decision has been made. Preliminary surveys begin next week. Construction in spring." He handed me a thick folder. "Here's the development plan. Make yourself familiar with it. You'll be expected to assist the survey team." After he left, I sat at my desk, stunned. The development plan outlined a comprehensive transformation of Wanajiska's most sacred spaces. Paved pathways, viewing platforms, comfort stations, all penetrating deep into areas I now understood were fiercely protected boundaries. That evening, I broke protocol and drove to Josephine's station without radio notice. I found her sitting on her porch, seemingly expecting me. "You heard," she said. "Not a question." I handed her the development plan. "Hayes is determined, says it's already funded and approved." She flipped through the pages, expression growing darker. "They've tried before, in '88, again in '06. Each time, accidents happened, equipment failures, inexplicable events that delayed work until funding dried up. And the warden retreated deeper each time. There used to be encounters much closer to the access roads. Now they only happen in the most remote areas. She closed the folder. They're losing ground, inch by inch. What happens if Hayes succeeds this time? Josephine's gaze turned toward the darkening forest. Nothing good, for anyone. I spent a restless night weighing impossible options. By morning, I'd made my decision. I couldn't stop the development directly, but I could ensure the survey team received a proper orientation to Wanagiska's special nature. The survey team arrived 3 days later, 2 engineers, a geologist, and an environmental assessment specialist. I volunteered to guide their preliminary exploration personally, suggesting we begin with the most challenging area, Ruby Creek Valley. As we hiked, I deliberately led them along paths I knew crossed territorial boundaries. I pointed out unusual formations, ancient trees, rare plant species, anything that might strengthen an environmental case against development. The specialist took notes, looking increasingly concerned about the project's impact. We made camp at the valley's edge, and as darkness fell, I quietly wandered away from the fire, into the trees. Far enough to not be overheard, but close enough to find my way back. I know you're watching. I spoke softly into the forest. You've seen the markers they're leaving. You know what's coming. Silence answered me, but the familiar sensation of observation intensified. I can't stop them alone, I continued, but they need to understand. They need to know this isn't just land to be developed. They need to see. A low, rumbling vocalization came from the darkness to my right. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or warning. I'm not betraying your presence, I promised, but they won't believe without experiencing something themselves. When I returned to camp, the mood had shifted. The team sat closer to the fire, voices hushed. They'd felt it too, the watchful presence, the weight of unseen eyes. That night it began. Subtle at first, rocks clacking together in rhythmic patterns too deliberate to be random. Heavy footsteps circling our camp just beyond the firelight. Brief glimpses of massive shadows moving between trees. By morning, the survey team was visibly shaken. The environmental specialist pulled me aside as we packed up. This place, she said, voice low. It feels different, important. My preliminary assessment will note significant concerns about disturbing the existing ecosystem. Throughout the day, the phenomena intensified. Equipment malfunctioned in specific areas. GPS readings jumped erratically. The geologist's samples disappeared from his pack when momentarily unattended. And the footprints, massive, unmistakable impressions appearing in places we'd walked just hours before, sometimes forming complete circles around our survey markers. I maintained professional skepticism outwardly while guiding them deeper into increasingly uncomfortable experiences. By the 3rd day, they'd requested to cut the survey short. None would explicitly mention what they'd sensed, seen, or heard, but their field notes contained enough red flags to potentially halt development. The night before our return to headquarters, I left camp alone one final time. At the edge of a small clearing, I found what I was both hoping for and dreading. The warden, waiting. In the moonlight, its massive form was fully visible for the first time. The breadth of its shoulders, the slope of its heavy brow, the intelligent eyes regarding me with unmistakable awareness. We stood regarding each other across 15 feet of open ground, neither advancing, neither retreating. A moment of recognition between guardians of different kinds. Slowly, deliberately, I removed my Forest Service badge and held it up, then placed it on a rock between us, a gesture whose meaning I hoped transcended species. An oath, a promise, a commitment to protection. The warden watched, motionless. Then, with surprising grace for its massive size, it bent and placed something beside my badge, a carved wooden figure, ancient and worn smooth by handling. A human form wearing what appeared to be a ranger's hat. Message received. We were not the first to stand this line. When I returned to camp, I found the survey team huddled together, awake despite the late hour. They'd heard something moving nearby, they said. Something large. Probably just a bear, I offered, the familiar lie coming easily now. In the morning we hiked out. At headquarters, the team delivered their initial assessment to Supervisor Hayes, citing dangerous terrain, fragile ecosystems, cultural significance to local tribes, and numerous logistical challenges. The development might still proceed, but it would face substantial delays and modifications. A month later, I received transfer orders. A lateral move to a more suitable assignment at a high-traffic national park. Hayes couldn't fire me outright, but he could remove me from Wanagiska. I submitted my resignation instead. My final night in the cabin, I packed my personal belongings but left something significant behind. My completed journal, containing everything I'd learned, placed precisely where Josephine would find it during the seasonal inventory. As dawn broke over Lake Ahoti for the last time, I stood on my porch, watching the mist rise from the water. Movement at the forest edge caught my eye. A massive figure, partially obscured by trees, observing my departure. Beside it, a smaller shape. Then another, a family group, watching. I raised my hand in farewell. The largest figure raised its arm in mirror response. Driving away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the wilderness receding behind me. One Ajuska had changed me fundamentally. I'd come seeking isolation but found connection to something ancient and profound, a contract between species to protect what mattered. The forest would keep its secrets, and somewhere deep in those shadows, guardians would continue their endless patrol, protecting boundaries between worlds that grew thinner with each passing year. Some would call them monsters. Having walked their boundaries and glimpsed their purpose, I knew better. In the battle between development and preservation, between human expansion and ancient wisdom, I'd chosen my side, and as the road curved, taking one Agiska from my sight, I knew with certainty I would return someday. Guardians always do. I was 34 when it happened. The cabin belonged to an old college friend named Rowan. We were tight back in school, bonded over bad horror movies and philosophy classes. But after graduation, he sort of dropped off the grid. Last I'd heard, he'd moved out to Tennessee to work for some conservation nonprofit. Next thing I knew, he was living completely off the land, building himself a cabin in the woods like some Appalachian Thoreau. The last time I'd spoken to him was 3 years ago, a drunken phone call at 2 a.m. where he'd rambled about the old ways and what the trees remember. I'd assumed it was just the isolation getting to him. People who live alone too long start talking to themselves, start seeing patterns that aren't there. Or so I thought. Then out of nowhere, he emailed me. The message was brief, almost urgent. Going to Alaska for a few weeks. Need someone to stay at my place while I'm gone. The dogs need company. Also, the solar setup's been glitching. Can you help? At the time, I was freelancing from a shoebox apartment in Asheville and kind of losing my mind from being enclosed so much. The walls seemed to press closer each day, the city noise grinding against my skull like rusty gears. The thought of 3 weeks in the woods sounded like a break I didn't know I needed. I said yes. He sent me a hand-drawn map with notes scrawled in his familiar, cramped handwriting. Don't trust Google Maps past Miller's Fork and watch the dip in the gravel before the logging cut. But there were other notes too, ones that should have warned me off. Don't go past the red markers after dark, and if you hear them calling, don't answer back. I dismissed them as Rowan's eccentric humor. He'd always been dramatic. Getting there was a full-day ordeal. Paved road turned to gravel, then gravel turned to dirt, then dirt turned into not much of a road at all. The trees grew denser as I climbed, their branches forming a canopy so thick that noon felt like dusk. Pine, oak, and something else I couldn't identify. Trees with bark that looked almost scaled, like reptilian skin stretched over bone. By the time I reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. The sun was ducking behind the trees, sending long shadows across the small meadow where Rowan had built his sanctuary. The dogs, 2 massive hounds named Baxter and Juniper, came barreling toward the truck like I was their long-lost packmate. But something was off about their enthusiasm. They circled the truck frantically, whining and pawing at the doors, but they kept glancing back at the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. Rowan's cabin was exactly what you'd picture, a single-room log structure with a sleeping loft, a fire pit out front, and a steel-shuttered shed that was chained and padlocked. The shed squatted in the shadows like a metal tumor, its surface rust-stained and pocked with what looked like claw marks. There was no electricity apart from a small solar array with a backup generator, and water came from a spring tank piped into the sink. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just trees and the sounds your brain isn't used to interpreting. But as I unloaded my gear, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. Scratches on the cabin's doorframe, deep gouges that went through the wood to the grain beneath. More scratches around the windows, too deliberate to be from animals, too jagged to be from tools. And hanging from the eaves, barely visible in the dying light, were what looked like small bundles of sticks and twine. Stick figures, dozens of them, swaying gently in the evening breeze. The dogs had gone quiet now, standing at the edge of the clearing with their hackles raised, staring into the woods, watching, waiting. I should have left then, should have loaded my gear back into the truck and driven straight back to civilization. But the rational part of my mind, the part that pays bills and maintains skepticism, convinced me that Rowan was just eccentric. Artists, hermits, they all had their quirks. The scratches could be from bears. The stick figures were probably just woodland decoration, some primitive art project. That first night, as I sat by the fire with a beer and a paperback novel, I told myself I was exactly where I needed to be. Away from deadlines, away from traffic, away from the constant electronic hum of modern life. The silence was so complete it felt like a presence, and for the first time in months, I could hear my own thoughts clearly. I was wrong about everything. The first couple of days were blissfully uneventful, or so I convinced myself. I woke early, hiked with the dogs, read paperbacks by propane light, and actually felt my shoulders start to unclench. There was something weirdly comforting about the routine. The quiet wasn't eerie, it was clean. No noise pollution, no constant background hum. But small things began to accumulate like splinters under the skin. That third morning, something small threw me off. One of the trail markers Rowan had strung around the property was missing. He used strips of bright blue plastic tape to mark the perimeter loops, and I was positive there'd been one tied to a tree just past the gully fork. But when I got there, it was gone. The bark on the tree showed a pale ring where the tape had been, as if it had been there for months, protecting the wood from weather, but now it was simply gone. I even circled back, wondering if I'd remembered wrong. Nope, it was just missing. I didn't think too hard about it. Figured maybe a deer brushed past and snagged it off, or wind tore it down. I replaced it with a fresh one from the roll Rowan kept in the supply box and moved on. But as I tied the new tape around the tree, I noticed something that made my blood chill. There, in the soft earth beneath the tree, was a bare footprint. Not a boot print, not a shoe print, a bare human foot, pressed deep into the mud. The toes were spread unnaturally wide, as if the owner had been crouching or gripping something, and the size, it was massive, easily twice the length of my own foot. I knelt down and studied it more carefully. The heel impression was so deep it suggested someone incredibly heavy, or someone who had been standing there for a very long time. But the most disturbing detail was around the edges of the print. The earth was marked with small, deliberate scratches, as if whoever had made the print had also been drawing in the dirt with their fingernails. Drawing, or counting. That night the dogs wouldn't settle. They paced around the cabin like they were trying to map it by scent. Ears pinned back, tails twitching, noses practically pressed to the floor. Every now and then one of them would stop and stare dead at the back door. Then the other would join, standing there like sentries. It put me on edge. I stood out on the porch with a flashlight for maybe 10 minutes, sweeping the tree line. I expected to catch eye shine or hear rustling. Nothing, just dense, unmovable dark. The beam of my flashlight seemed to get swallowed by the forest, reaching maybe 20 feet before being absorbed by an impenetrable wall of shadow. But as I turned to go back inside, the light caught something that made me freeze. There, hanging from a branch about 30 feet into the woods, was another stick figure. This one was larger than the others, almost human-sized, and it was bound with what looked like strips of blue plastic tape. The same tape Rowan used for trail markers. The same tape that had gone missing. I bolted the door and left the lantern on. Around 2:20 a.m., I had just started to drift off in the loft when both dogs launched themselves at the kitchen window. Barking wasn't even the word. It was guttural, furious, like they were trying to tear through the glass. It was so sudden I almost fell off the mattress. And the weirdest part? I didn't move. I didn't go look. I sat there frozen, heart pounding in my ears. It wasn't fear. It was more like every part of me knew I shouldn't get closer, like even turning my head would break something. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming that whatever was out there, it wanted me to look. It was counting on me to look. I reached over, turned off the lantern, and then they just stopped mid-growl, like someone hit pause. No panting, no pacing, no soft huffing like dogs do after barking. Just silence. It went on so long I started wondering if something had knocked them out cold. They didn't sleep the rest of the night. Neither did I. In the morning I found them huddled together in the corner farthest from the window, trembling. Their eyes were bloodshot, and when I called their names, they barely responded. It was like they'd seen something that had drained the life from them. Next morning I went outside and circled around to the window. That's when I saw it. In the mud below the sill was a footprint, bare, wide, toes spread unnaturally far apart. You could see where the arch dipped and the heel sunk deep, and it was fresh. The ground hadn't been wet for days, so whatever made it had been there that night. What got me most was the angle. It wasn't just someone walking by. They had been facing the glass, leaning in, close enough that their breath should have fogged the window, close enough to count my heartbeats. But there were other details that made the scene even more disturbing. Around the footprint were smaller marks, finger impressions in the soil, as if someone had been crawling or moving on all fours before standing up to peer through the window. And scratched into the earth in a rough circle around the print were symbols, not letters, not anything I recognized, but deliberate marks carved with something sharp. They looked almost like a primitive counting system, tally marks, but wrong somehow. Too many lines, crossing in patterns that hurt to look at for too long. That afternoon I took the dogs on a longer loop, up the ridge and around the back, just to not be at the cabin for a bit. I figured some weird hermit might be squatting nearby. It's not unheard of in these remote areas. People drop off the grid, lose their grip on social norms, start reverting to something more primitive. When we passed the same spot where the trail tape had gone missing, I noticed something tucked into the base of a cedar tree. At first I thought it was just debris, but when I stepped closer, I saw it clearly. A little stick figure, twigs bound together with twine and something that looked like it might have been dried tendon or stripped bark. The torso was wrapped in a rag of blue plastic, the same kind of tape Rowan used. The arms were long and bent at odd angles, like it had been twisted wrong on purpose, and it wasn't left out in the open. It was tucked deep into the roots, like it was meant to be hidden but still found. But the most unsettling detail was the head. Instead of a simple twig, someone had carved a small piece of wood into a rough approximation of a human skull, and pressed into the eye sockets were what looked like small animal teeth. The mouth was a jagged gash, stuffed with what might have been moss or dried blood. I didn't touch it, but as I turned to leave, I noticed there were more, hidden in the underbrush, tucked behind trees, hanging from low branches, dozens of stick figures, all facing the same direction, all pointing toward Rowan's cabin. We headed straight back, but the dogs were acting even stranger now. They kept stopping, heads cocked, listening to something I couldn't hear. Their ears would swivel toward sounds that didn't exist, and they'd whine in harmony, a low, mournful note that seemed to echo through the trees long after they'd stopped making it. That evening I went to the shed. I'd been ignoring it, but something in me needed to see what was inside. The lock was old and clunky. I popped it open with a bolt cutter Rowan had left in the firewood pile. Inside were tarps, canned beans, rope, and an ancient two-way radio. But tucked behind a stack of buckets were two long hunting spears, handmade, heavy. One had a red-brown crust around the tip, not rust, something else, something organic. There were other things too. A collection of animal skulls arranged on a makeshift altar, candles burned down to nubs, their wax pooled in strange patterns, and journals, dozens of them, filled with Rowan's handwriting, but not the Rowan I remembered from college. This writing was cramped, frantic, full of observations about the Watchers and the old agreements. One entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, made my blood freeze. They're getting bolder. Found 3 more figures today, closer to the house. The arrangement is almost complete. He knows I'm leaving soon. I can feel him testing the boundaries, seeing how much he can push before I'm gone. I've tried to explain to him about the new caretaker, but he doesn't understand modern concepts. He thinks in terms of territory, of blood, of ownership. I'm afraid of what he'll do when he realizes I'm not coming back. The spears are ready. I've left them where the new caretaker can find them, if it comes to that. I hope it doesn't. I hope 3 weeks is enough time for him to understand, to accept the transition. But if not, I've written instructions in the red journal. God help whoever finds this. I searched frantically for the red journal, but it was nowhere to be found. Just empty journal after empty journal, and that radio, crackling with static when I turned it on. I didn't investigate further. I just closed the door and locked it again. At 4:17 a.m., the voice came. Not from outside, not from the porch or the yard, from the wall. It spoke just once, slow and rough like it hadn't used words in years. He's not gone. He's still here. It wasn't a whisper. It was inside the wall, like the timbers themselves were forming the sound. The dogs whined and crawled beneath the loft ladder without a single bark. I didn't breathe. I didn't answer. I sat perfectly still and waited. But then I heard something else. Scratching. Slow, methodical scratching coming from inside the walls. Like something with very long fingernails was carving symbols into the wood from the inside. The sound went on for hours, stopping only when the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows. In the morning I packed water and hiked further down the ridge than I had before. I needed distance from the cabin, needed to think clearly about what was happening. But the farther I went from Rowan's property, the more I began to understand that the strangeness wasn't confined to his land. It was everywhere. The trees themselves seemed wrong, bark patterns that looked almost like faces when caught in peripheral vision, branches that hung at impossible angles, defying gravity and botany both. And the silence, it wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was the held-breath silence of something vast and patient, waiting. That's where I found the basin. There was a pit, deep, with 2 snapped support poles across the top. But as I got closer, I realized this wasn't a natural formation. Someone had dug this, carefully and deliberately. The sides were too smooth, too symmetrical, and the supports weren't random fallen trees. They were carved, marked with the same symbols I'd seen scratched around the footprints. Inside were bones. Big ones, clean but arranged in a kind of ring around the edges, like someone had set them there on purpose. It looked almost ceremonial. But these weren't animal bones. The femurs were too long, the skulls too large and oddly shaped, and there were too many of them. Dozens of skeletons, maybe more, all picked clean and arranged in patterns that suggested ritual, worship, offering. At the center of the bone circle was a depression in the earth, filled with what looked like ash and char. But mixed in with the burned material were other things. Pieces of blue plastic tape, fragments of metal that might have been tools or weapons, and teeth, human teeth, scattered like seeds. I knelt at the edge of the pit, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a burial ground. It was something older, more primitive, a place where offerings were made to something that demanded them. Then I turned and caught movement on the far slope. Someone was crouched in the brush, still as stone, watching. The figure was perhaps 60 yards away, but even at that distance I could see details that made my vision tunnel with terror. Skin streaked with mud or dried blood, no clothes, limbs that seemed too long for the torso, and that tilt of the head, the patient, predatory tilt of something that had been watching me long before I noticed it. The face, when it caught the light, was all wrong. The features were human, but stretched, distorted. Eyes too large and too dark, set in deep sockets. The mouth was a gash that split the face nearly from ear to ear, revealing teeth that were either filed to points or naturally carnivorous. But the worst part was the recognition. Even distorted, even transformed by whatever had been done to it, I recognized the bone structure, the general shape of the skull, the way the shoulders sloped. It was Rowan, or what was left of him. I didn't yell. I didn't grab the dogs. I just ran. But as I fled, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots, I could hear movement behind me, not footsteps, something that moved through the forest like it belonged there, like it was part of the ecosystem. Branches didn't break under its weight. Leaves didn't rustle. It moved like flowing water, like wind, like something that had learned to be part of the forest itself. And it was following me back to the cabin. That night I shoved the fridge in front of the door and loaded the shotgun Rowan kept hidden above the lintel. I'd found the shells in the shed, along with a note in Rowan's handwriting. Iron and salt in the loads. It won't kill him, but it might slow him down. The dogs were beyond agitated now. They'd lost the ability to bark, only managing strangled whines that sounded almost human. They clustered around me like they understood that I was their only hope of survival, but their eyes kept rolling back to show white, and foam collected at the corners of their mouths. As darkness fell, the sounds began. First, scratching on the roof. Slow, methodical, like something with very long claws was testing each shingle, each board, looking for weaknesses. Then came the footsteps, not around the cabin but underneath it. Whatever was down there was moving through the crawl space, mapping the floor above, learning the layout. At midnight, the real show started. The stick figures hanging from the eaves began to move, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. They turned, all of them, orienting to face the windows, and as they moved, I could hear them whisper. Dozens of tiny voices, all speaking in unison. He's not gone. He's still here. He's not gone. He's still here. The voice from the walls joined in, and then others. Voices from the crawl space, from the roof, from the forest itself. A chorus of the same 4 words, repeated endlessly, growing louder with each repetition. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound wasn't coming through them. It was inside my skull, vibrating through bone and brain tissue. The words became a physical presence, a pressure that built behind my eyes until I thought my head might split. That's when I understood. Rowan hadn't gone to Alaska. There was no trip, no conservation work, no reason for me to be here except as a replacement. He'd found something in these woods, or something had found him, something old, something that needed a caretaker, a guardian, a sacrifice. And when Rowan had tried to leave, it had changed him, transformed him into what I'd seen crouching in the forest. But the thing needed someone new, someone to tend the bone circles, to arrange the offerings, to maintain the old agreements. It had allowed Rowan to send for me, to lure me here with promises of solitude and peace. I was never supposed to leave. The scratching on the roof intensified, and I heard boards creaking, straining. Whatever was up there was heavy, much heavier than any human should be. Dust rained from the ceiling beams, and somewhere in the walls, pipes began to groan and sing with pressure. Then the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was expectant, pregnant with possibility. Something was about to happen, and every molecule of air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. A gentle knock at the door. 3 soft raps, polite and patient, the kind of knock a neighbor might make when bringing over a casserole. The dogs went rigid, their eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. "Hello?" a voice called out. Rowan's voice, but wrong somehow. The words were shaped correctly, but they came from a throat that had been restructured, vocal cords that had been tuned to different frequencies. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Another knock, still gentle, still patient. "I want to explain about the arrangement, about your responsibilities, about what you'll become." I pressed myself against the wall, shotgun clutched in shaking hands. Through the window I could see a silhouette on the porch, tall, too tall, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. The head cocked at an angle that would have broken a human neck. Rowan tried to fight it, the voice continued, conversational and calm. He thought he could leave, thought he could break the old agreements, but the forest doesn't let go easily. It changes you, improves you, makes you part of something larger, something eternal. The scratching resumed, but now it was coming from all sides, the walls, the roof, the foundation, as if dozens of creatures were converging on the cabin, all working together to tear it apart board by board. "You can make this easy," the Rowan thing said. "Come outside. Let me show you the basin, the bone circles, the places where the old blood still flows. I'll teach you the rituals, the proper way to arrange the offerings. You'll understand eventually. They all do." The door handle turned slowly, testing the lock. "Or you can make this hard. But you should know, I've been patient with the others. The hikers, the hunters, the lost ones who wander too deep into the green places. Their bones are already in the basin. Their voices already join the chorus. You won't be the first, and you won't be the last." By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I threw everything in the truck, called the dogs, and drove until my GPS blinked back to life in a little town called Wilkins Hollow. I pulled over at a gas station and used the payphone to leave Rowan a message. Told him the place was fine. Said I left a few days early to take a gig back home. But I knew the truth. Rowan would never get that message, because Rowan was still there, transformed into something that served the old hungers of the forest. And someday, when the isolation of modern life became too much for someone else, when another friend needed a place to escape for a few weeks, the cycle would begin again. The forest is patient. It has all the time in the world, and it's always looking for new caretakers. I just pray it never comes looking for me. Found among the papers of a freelance writer who disappeared while hiking in the Cherokee National Forest. Local authorities report no record of a Rowan owning property in the search area. The cabin described in this account has never been located. I was 34 when it happened. The cabin belonged to an old college friend named Rowan. We were tight back in school, bonded over bad horror movies and philosophy classes. But after graduation, he sort of dropped off the grid. Last I'd heard, he'd moved out to Tennessee to work for some conservation nonprofit. Next thing I knew, he was living completely off the land, building himself a cabin in the woods like some Appalachian Thoreau. The last time I'd spoken to him was 3 years ago, a drunken phone call at 2 a.m. where he'd rambled about the old ways and what the trees remember. I'd assumed it was just the isolation getting to him. People who live alone too long start talking to themselves, start seeing patterns that aren't there. Or so I thought. Then out of nowhere, he emailed me. The message was brief, almost urgent. "Going to Alaska for a few weeks. Need someone to stay at my place while I'm gone. The dogs need company. Also, the solar setup's been glitching. Can you help?" At the time, I was freelancing from a shoebox apartment in Asheville and kind of losing my mind from being enclosed so much. The walls seemed to press closer each day, the city noise grinding against my skull like rusty gears. The thought of 3 weeks in the woods sounded like a break I didn't know I needed. I said yes. He sent me a hand-drawn map with notes scrawled in his familiar, cramped handwriting. "Don't trust Google Maps past Miller's Fork and watch the dip in the gravel before the logging cut." But there were other notes too, ones that should have warned me off. "Don't go past the red markers after dark, and if you hear them calling, don't answer back." I dismissed them as Rowan's eccentric humor. He'd always been dramatic. Getting there was a full-day ordeal. Paved road turned to gravel, then gravel turned to dirt, then dirt turned into not much of a road at all. The trees grew denser as I climbed, their branches forming a canopy so thick that noon felt like dusk. Pine, oak, and something else I couldn't identify. Trees with bark that looked almost scaled, like reptilian skin stretched over bone. By the time I reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. The sun was ducking behind the trees, sending long shadows across the small meadow where Rowan had built his sanctuary. The dogs, two massive hounds named Baxter and Juniper, came barreling toward the truck like I was their long-lost packmate. But something was off about their enthusiasm. They circled the truck frantically, whining and pawing at the doors, but they kept glancing back at the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. Rowan's cabin was exactly what you'd picture. A single-room log structure with a sleeping loft, a fire pit out front, and a steel-shuttered shed that was chained and padlocked. The shed squatted in the shadows like a metal tumor, its surface rust-stained and pocked with what looked like claw marks. There was no electricity apart from a small solar array with a backup generator, and water came from a spring tank piped into the sink. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just trees and the sounds your brain isn't used to interpreting. But as I unloaded my gear, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. Scratches on the cabin's doorframe, deep gouges that went through the wood to the grain beneath. More scratches around the windows, too deliberate to be from animals, too jagged to be from tools. And hanging from the eaves, barely visible in the dying light, were what looked like small bundles of sticks and twine. Stick figures, dozens of them, swaying gently in the evening breeze. The dogs had gone quiet now, standing at the edge of the clearing with their hackles raised, staring into the woods, watching, waiting. I should have left then, should have loaded my gear back into the truck and driven straight back to civilization. But the rational part of my mind, the part that pays bills and maintains skepticism, convinced me that Rowan was just eccentric. Artists, hermits, they all had their quirks. The scratches could be from bears. The stick figures were probably just woodland decoration, some primitive art project. That first night, as I sat by the fire with a beer and a paperback novel, I told myself I was exactly where I needed to be. Away from deadlines, away from traffic, away from the constant electronic hum of modern life. The silence was so complete it felt like a presence, and for the first time in months, I could hear my own thoughts clearly. I was wrong about everything. The first couple of days were blissfully uneventful, or so I convinced myself. I woke early, hiked with the dogs, read paperbacks by propane light, and actually felt my shoulders start to unclench. There was something weirdly comforting about the routine. The quiet wasn't eerie, it was clean. No noise pollution, no constant background hum. But small things began to accumulate like splinters under the skin. That third morning, something small threw me off. One of the trail markers Rowan had strung around the property was missing. He used strips of bright blue plastic tape to mark the perimeter loops, and I was positive there'd been one tied to a tree just past the gully fork. But when I got there, it was gone. The bark on the tree showed a pale ring where the tape had been, as if it had been there for months, protecting the wood from weather, but now it was simply gone. I even circled back, wondering if I'd remembered wrong. Nope, it was just missing. I didn't think too hard about it. Figured maybe a deer brushed past and snagged it off, or wind tore it down. I replaced it with a fresh one from the roll Rowan kept in the supply box and moved on. But as I tied the new tape around the tree, I noticed something that made my blood chill. There, in the soft earth beneath the tree, was a bare footprint. Not a boot print, not a shoe print, a bare human foot, pressed deep into the mud. The toes were spread unnaturally wide, as if the owner had been crouching or gripping something, and the size, it was massive, easily twice the length of my own foot. I knelt down and studied it more carefully. The heel impression was so deep it suggested someone incredibly heavy, or someone who had been standing there for a very long time. But the most disturbing detail was around the edges of the print. The earth was marked with small, deliberate scratches, as if whoever had made the print had also been drawing in the dirt with their fingernails. Drawing, or counting. That night the dogs wouldn't settle. They paced around the cabin like they were trying to map it by scent. Ears pinned back, tails twitching, noses practically pressed to the floor. Every now and then one of them would stop and stare dead at the back door. Then the other would join, standing there like sentries. It put me on edge. I stood out on the porch with a flashlight for maybe 10 minutes, sweeping the tree line. I expected to catch eye shine or hear rustling. Nothing, just dense, unmovable dark. The beam of my flashlight seemed to get swallowed by the forest, reaching maybe 20 feet before being absorbed by an impenetrable wall of shadow. But as I turned to go back inside, the light caught something that made me freeze. There, hanging from a branch about 30 feet into the woods, was another stick figure. This one was larger than the others, almost human-sized, and it was bound with what looked like strips of blue plastic tape. The same tape Rowan used for trail markers. The same tape that had gone missing. I bolted the door and left the lantern on. Around 2:20 a.m., I had just started to drift off in the loft when both dogs launched themselves at the kitchen window. Barking wasn't even the word. It was guttural, furious, like they were trying to tear through the glass. It was so sudden I almost fell off the mattress. And the weirdest part? I didn't move. I didn't go look. I sat there frozen, heart pounding in my ears. It wasn't fear. It was more like every part of me knew I shouldn't get closer, like even turning my head would break something. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming that whatever was out there, it wanted me to look. It was counting on me to look. I reached over, turned off the lantern, and then they just stopped mid-growl, like someone hit pause. No panting, no pacing, no soft huffing like dogs do after barking. Just silence. It went on so long I started wondering if something had knocked them out cold. They didn't sleep the rest of the night. Neither did I. In the morning I found them huddled together in the corner farthest from the window, trembling. Their eyes were bloodshot, and when I called their names, they barely responded. It was like they'd seen something that had drained the life from them. Next morning I went outside and circled around to the window. That's when I saw it. In the mud below the sill was a footprint, bare, wide, toes spread unnaturally far apart. You could see where the arch dipped and the heel sunk deep, and it was fresh. The ground hadn't been wet for days, so whatever made it had been there that night. What got me most was the angle. It wasn't just someone walking by. They had been facing the glass, leaning in, close enough that their breath should have fogged the window, close enough to count my heartbeats. But there were other details that made the scene even more disturbing. Around the footprint were smaller marks, finger impressions in the soil, as if someone had been crawling or moving on all fours before standing up to peer through the window. And scratched into the earth in a rough circle around the print were symbols, not letters, not anything I recognized, but deliberate marks carved with something sharp. They looked almost like a primitive counting system, tally marks, but wrong somehow. Too many lines, crossing in patterns that hurt to look at for too long. That afternoon I took the dogs on a longer loop, up the ridge and around the back, just to not be at the cabin for a bit. I figured some weird hermit might be squatting nearby. It's not unheard of in these remote areas. People drop off the grid, lose their grip on social norms, start reverting to something more primitive. When we passed the same spot where the trail tape had gone missing, I noticed something tucked into the base of a cedar tree. At first I thought it was just debris, but when I stepped closer, I saw it clearly. A little stick figure, twigs bound together with twine and something that looked like it might have been dried tendon or stripped bark. The torso was wrapped in a rag of blue plastic, the same kind of tape Rowan used. The arms were long and bent at odd angles, like it had been twisted wrong on purpose, and it wasn't left out in the open. It was tucked deep into the roots, like it was meant to be hidden but still found. But the most unsettling detail was the head. Instead of a simple twig, someone had carved a small piece of wood into a rough approximation of a human skull, and pressed into the eye sockets were what looked like small animal teeth. The mouth was a jagged gash, stuffed with what might have been moss or dried blood. I didn't touch it, but as I turned to leave, I noticed there were more. Hidden in the underbrush, tucked behind trees, hanging from low branches, dozens of stick figures, all facing the same direction, all pointing toward Rowan's cabin. We headed straight back, but the dogs were acting even stranger now. They kept stopping, heads cocked, listening to something I couldn't hear. Their ears would swivel toward sounds that didn't exist, and they'd whine in harmony, a low, mournful note that seemed to echo through the trees long after they'd stopped making it. That evening I went to the shed. I'd been ignoring it, but something in me needed to see what was inside. The lock was old and clunky. I popped it open with a bolt cutter Rowan had left in the firewood pile. Inside were tarps, canned beans, rope, and an ancient two-way radio. But tucked behind a stack of buckets were two long hunting spears, handmade, heavy. One had a red-brown crust around the tip, not rust, something else, something organic. There were other things too. A collection of animal skulls arranged on a makeshift altar, candles burned down to nubs, their wax pooled in strange patterns, and journals, dozens of them, filled with Rowan's handwriting. But not the Rowan I remembered from college. This writing was cramped, frantic, full of observations about the Watchers and the old agreements. One entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, made my blood freeze. They're getting bolder. Found 3 more figures today, closer to the house. The arrangement is almost complete. He knows I'm leaving soon. I can feel him testing the boundaries, seeing how much he can push before I'm gone. I've tried to explain to him about the new caretaker, but he doesn't understand modern concepts. He thinks in terms of territory, of blood, of ownership. I'm afraid of what he'll do when he realizes I'm not coming back. The spears are ready. I've left them where the new caretaker can find them, if it comes to that. I hope it doesn't. I hope 3 weeks is enough time for him to understand, to accept the transition. But if not, I've written instructions in the red journal. God help whoever finds this. I searched frantically for the red journal, but it was nowhere to be found. Just empty journal after empty journal, and that radio, crackling with static when I turned it on. I didn't investigate further. I just closed the door and locked it again. At 4:17 a.m., the voice came. Not from outside, not from the porch or the yard, from the wall. It spoke just once, slow and rough like it hadn't used words in years. He's not gone. He's still here. It wasn't a whisper. It was inside the wall, like the timbers themselves were forming the sound. The dogs whined and crawled beneath the loft ladder without a single bark. I didn't breathe. I didn't answer. I sat perfectly still and waited. But then I heard something else. Scratching. Slow, methodical scratching coming from inside the walls. Like something with very long fingernails was carving symbols into the wood from the inside. The sound went on for hours, stopping only when the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows. In the morning, I packed water and hiked further down the ridge than I had before. I needed distance from the cabin, needed to think clearly about what was happening. But the farther I went from Rowan's property, the more I began to understand that the strangeness wasn't confined to his land. It was everywhere. The trees themselves seemed wrong. Bark patterns that looked almost like faces when caught in peripheral vision. Branches that hung at impossible angles, defying gravity and botany both. And the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was the hell-breath silence of something vast and patient, waiting. That's where I found the basin. There was a pit, deep, with 2 snap support poles across the top. But as I got closer, I realized this wasn't a natural formation. Someone had dug this, carefully and deliberately. The sides were too smooth, too symmetrical, and the supports weren't random fallen trees. They were carved, marked with the same symbols I'd seen scratched around the footprints. Inside were bones. Big ones, clean but arranged in a kind of ring around the edges, like someone had set them there on purpose. It looked almost ceremonial. But these weren't animal bones. The femurs were too long, the skulls too large and oddly shaped, and there were too many of them. Dozens of skeletons, maybe more, all picked clean and arranged in patterns that suggested ritual, worship, offering. At the center of the bone circle was a depression in the earth, filled with what looked like ash and char. But mixed in with the burned material were other things. Pieces of blue plastic tape, fragments of metal that might have been tools or weapons, and teeth, human teeth, scattered like seeds. I knelt at the edge of the pit, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a burial ground. It was something older, more primitive, a place where offerings were made to something that demanded them. Then I turned and caught movement on the far slope. Someone was crouched in the brush, still as stone, watching. The figure was perhaps 60 yards away, but even at that distance I could see details that made my vision tunnel with terror. Skin streaked with mud or dried blood, no clothes, limbs that seemed too long for the torso, and that tilt of the head, the patient, predatory tilt of something that had been watching me long before I noticed it. The face, when it caught the light, was all wrong. The features were human, but stretched, distorted. Eyes too large and too dark, set in deep sockets. The mouth was a gash that split the face nearly from ear to ear, revealing teeth that were either filed to points or naturally carnivorous. But the worst part was the recognition. Even distorted, even transformed by whatever had been done to it, I recognized the bone structure, the general shape of the skull, the way the shoulders sloped. It was Rowan, or what was left of him. I didn't yell. I didn't grab the dogs. I just ran. But as I fled, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots, I could hear movement behind me, not footsteps, something that moved through the forest like it belonged there, like it was part of the ecosystem. Branches didn't break under its weight. Leaves didn't rustle. It moved like flowing water, like wind, like something that had learned to be part of the forest itself. And it was following me back to the cabin. That night I shoved the fridge in front of the door and loaded the shotgun Rowan kept hidden above the lintel. I'd found the shells in the shed, along with a note in Rowan's handwriting. Iron and salt in the loads. It won't kill him, but it might slow him down. The dogs were beyond agitated now. They'd lost the ability to bark, only managing strangled whines that sounded almost human. They clustered around me like they understood that I was their only hope of survival, but their eyes kept rolling back to show white, and foam collected at the corners of their mouths. As darkness fell, the sounds began. First, scratching on the roof. Slow, methodical, like something with very long claws was testing each shingle, each board, looking for weaknesses. Then came the footsteps, not around the cabin but underneath it. Whatever was down there was moving through the crawl space, mapping the floor above, learning the layout. At midnight, the real show started. The stick figures hanging from the eaves began to move, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. They turned, all of them, orienting to face the windows, and as they moved, I could hear them whisper. Dozens of tiny voices, all speaking in unison. "He's not gone. He's still here. He's not gone. He's still here." The voice from the walls joined in, and then others. Voices from the crawl space, from the roof, from the forest itself. A chorus of the same 4 words, repeated endlessly, growing louder with each repetition. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound wasn't coming through them. It was inside my skull, vibrating through bone and brain tissue. The words became a physical presence, a pressure that built behind my eyes until I thought my head might split. That's when I understood. Rowan hadn't gone to Alaska. There was no trip, no conservation work, no reason for me to be here except as a replacement. He'd found something in these woods, or something had found him, something old, something that needed a caretaker, a guardian, a sacrifice. And when Rowan had tried to leave, it had changed him, transformed him into what I'd seen crouching in the forest. But the thing needed someone new. Someone to tend the bone circles, to arrange the offerings, to maintain the old agreements. It had allowed Rowan to send for me, to lure me here with promises of solitude and peace. I was never supposed to leave. The scratching on the roof intensified, and I heard boards creaking, straining. Whatever was up there was heavy, much heavier than any human should be. Dust rained from the ceiling beams, and somewhere in the walls, pipes began to groan and sing with pressure. Then the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was expectant, pregnant with possibility. Something was about to happen, and every molecule of air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. A gentle knock at the door. 3 soft raps, polite and patient, the kind of knock a neighbor might make when bringing over a casserole. The dogs went rigid, their eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. "Hello?" a voice called out. Rowan's voice, but wrong somehow. The words were shaped correctly, but they came from a throat that had been restructured, vocal cords that had been tuned to different frequencies. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Another knock, still gentle, still patient. "I want to explain about the arrangement, about your responsibilities, about what you'll become." I pressed myself against the wall, shotgun clutched in shaking hands. Through the window I could see a silhouette on the porch, tall, too tall, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. The head cocked at an angle that would have broken a human neck. Rowan tried to fight it, the voice continued, conversational and calm. He thought he could leave, thought he could break the old agreements, but the forest doesn't let go easily. It changes you, improves you, makes you part of something larger, something eternal. The scratching resumed, but now it was coming from all sides, the walls, the roof, the foundation, as if dozens of creatures were converging on the cabin, all working together to tear it apart board by board. "You can make this easy," the Rowan thing said. "Come outside. Let me show you the basin, the bone circles, the places where the old blood still flows. I'll teach you the rituals, the proper way to arrange the offerings. You'll understand eventually. They all do." The door handle turned slowly, testing the lock. "Or you can make this hard. But you should know, I've been patient with the others. The hikers, the hunters, the lost ones who wander too deep into the green places. Their bones are already in the basin. Their voices already join the chorus. You won't be the first, and you won't be the last." By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I threw everything in the truck, called the dogs, and drove until my GPS blinked back to life in a little town called Wilkins Hollow. I pulled over at a gas station and used the payphone to leave Rowan a message. Told him the place was fine. Said I left a few days early to take a gig back home. But I knew the truth. Rowan would never get that message, because Rowan was still there, transformed into something that served the old hungers of the forest. And someday, when the isolation of modern life became too much for someone else, when another friend needed a place to escape for a few weeks, the cycle would begin again. The forest is patient. It has all the time in the world, and it's always looking for new caretakers. I just pray it never comes looking for me. Found among the papers of a freelance writer who disappeared while hiking in the Cherokee National Forest. Local authorities report no record of a Rowan owning property in the search area. The cabin described in this account has never been located,